Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was early October last year, just as the leaves began turning that golden way, and the air held a crispness that made everything feel alive. I had been planning this hike for months, a solo trek through a lesser-known trail deep in the Appalachians. Hiking was more than a hobby for me. It was my way to disconnect from the buzz of emails and the monotony of 9-to-5 life. It gave me a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. I had told my brother and a couple of close friends where I'd be heading, giving them a rough idea of the trail and my expected return. The trail I'd chosen wasn't on any major tourist maps, but it had a reputation among serious hikers for its untouched beauty. Unlike the overcrowded paths littered with rappers and noisy chatter, this one promised solitude, a stretch of nature where it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. That Friday morning, I loaded up my aging but reliable Jeep with all the essentials: a tent, my trusted sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and my pocket knife just in case. My backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the gear, but I brushed it off. I wasn't new to this. Years of weekend hiking trips had taught me how to pack light, yet stay prepared. I even carried an old notebook to jot down thoughts or sketch the scenery whenever inspiration struck. The drive to the trailhead took about 4 hours. Long stretches of highway melted into winding back roads, with towering trees arching overhead. As I got closer to the start point, the asphalt gave way to gravel, and my tires crunched against the uneven surface. Cell service faded out about an hour before I reached the parking lot, but that was part of the plan. No interruptions, no distractions. The parking lot, if you could call it that, was little more than a clearing in the woods with a single wooden sign marking the trailhead. My Jeep was the only vehicle there. It was both a relief and, admittedly, a little unsettling. I reminded myself that solitude was the point. After all, I'd been craving some time alone. The trail itself started innocently enough, winding through dense thickets of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The smell of damp earth and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze were soothing. For the first few hours, everything went as planned. I stopped occasionally to admire a striking tree formation or to snap a quick photo of a particularly scenic overlook. There were no sounds but my own footsteps and the occasional chirp of birds, no hum of highways or distant voices to interrupt the serenity. As the day wore on, I found myself sinking into the rhythm of the hike. The trail alternated between gentle inclines and sharp descents, with the ground beneath shifting from compact soil to patches of loose stones that threatened to twist an ankle if I wasn't careful. I kept an eye on my map, a folded paper one I'd picked up from an outdoor supply store. This might have been easier, but I liked the tactile feel of a map, the way it forced me to engage with the terrain. I reached a clearing around mid-afternoon, a spot I'd picked beforehand to set up camp for the first night. It was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek flowing nearby. The water sparkled in the late afternoon sun, and its gentle burbling added to the peaceful atmosphere. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, placing my sleeping bag inside and arranging my gear neatly at the entrance. The rest of the evening was uneventful in the best possible way. I boiled some water over a portable stove for a dehydrated meal that, while not exactly gourmet, felt satisfying after a day of physical effort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat by the creek, letting the sound of the water fill the growing silence around me. When night finally fell, it was absolute. No streetlights, no glow of nearby houses, just a blanket of darkness, broken only by the faint light of the stars overhead. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into the sleeping bag, feeling that rare kind of exhaustion that comes from a day spent outdoors. I'd drift off soon, ready for the next leg of the hike in the morning. Or so I thought. I woke up sometime after midnight, disoriented and unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. My sleeping bag was warm, the fabric of the tent pressing softly against my head, and the gentle gurgle of the creek was the only sound outside. I lay there, eyes open, staring into the pitch blackness, trying to decide if it was just a restless moment or if something had disturbed me. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling outside the tent, like someone or something moving through the leaves. My immediate thought was that it was an animal. Raccoons, foxes, and even the occasional black bear weren't uncommon in these woods. I'd taken the usual precautions, hanging my food in a bear bag far from the campsite, and I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Still, I stayed motionless, listening intently. The sound came again, this time closer. It wasn't just the soft crunch of leaves, but something heavier, like the deliberate step of a human foot. My heart began to pound. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, and reached for the flashlight I'd left beside my sleeping bag. My fingers fumbled with the switch for a moment before the beam flicked on, casting a harsh white light across the inside of the tent. I hesitated before unzipping the tent flap, telling myself again that it was probably just an animal. But the weight behind those footsteps, it didn't feel right. The thought of another person being out here, in the middle of nowhere, sent a chill down my spine. This trail was remote, far from any main roads or campsites. I'd seen no signs of anyone else all day. Taking a deep breath, I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the immediate area. The clearing looked the same as it had when I'd set up camp empty, still. My gear was undisturbed, the trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the creek continued its steady murmur. Nothing seemed out of place. I exhaled in relief, convincing myself it had been my imagination, or perhaps a deer passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered as I zipped the tent back up and settled into the sleeping bag. I left the flashlight on, its glow providing a small comfort as I tried to drift back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come easily. The following morning, I woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the fabric of the tent. The strange sounds from the night before felt like a distant memory, almost dreamlike in the clarity of daylight. I packed up my gear and had a quick breakfast by the creek, forcing myself to brush off the unease. I was being paranoid, I told myself. Spending time alone in the woods could play tricks on the mind. The day's hike was uneventful at first. The trail meandered through dense forest, the sunlight dappling the ground through a canopy of leaves. Every so often, I'd hear the call of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel darting through the undergrowth. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of dirt and twigs beneath my boots grounding me in the moment. By midday, I'd reached a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the surrounding forest. I decided to take a break, sitting on a flat rock and pulling out a granola bar from my pack. The air was cool but not unpleasant, and the breeze carried the scent of pine. I was alone, completely alone, with nothing but the vastness of the woods stretching out before me. But that's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the edge of the tree line below, there was movement. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a large bird. But the way it moved caught my attention. It wasn't the quick, darting motion of wildlife, but something slower, more deliberate. I squinted, shielding my eyes from the sun, trying to make out what it was. It was a figure. The shape was indistinct, too far away to see any details, but it was undeniably human in size and posture. They were standing still, partially obscured by the trees. For a moment, I felt relief-proof that I wasn't the only person out here. But as I watched, a strange feeling crept over me. They weren't moving, not in the way a hiker would. They just stood there, almost as if they were watching. I waved, more out of instinct than anything else. The figure didn't respond. I waited a few moments, expecting them to wave back or call out, but there was nothing. A growing sense of discomfort gnawed at me, and I decided it was time to move on. Slinging my pack over my shoulders, I left the outcrop and continued down the trail, resisting the urge to glance back. By late afternoon, I'd put several miles between myself and the spot where I'd seen the figure. The forest was growing thicker, the path narrowing into a series of switchbacks that wound steeply downhill. I was exhausted but determined to reach the next planned campsite before nightfall. My legs ached with each step, and my water supply was running low, but the thought of a hot meal and rest kept me moving. I finally reached a small clearing nestled between two ridges. It was less picturesque than my first campsite, but functional enough. I pitched the tent quickly, my movements hurried by the fading light. The evening passed quietly, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd pause, listening to the stillness around me, but there were no footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. As darkness fell, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. The figure from earlier lingered in my thoughts, their stillness haunting me. Why hadn't they waved back? What were they doing out here, so far from any marked trail? I forced myself to rationalize. Maybe they were another solo hiker, enjoying the same solitude I sought. Maybe they hadn't even seen me, or perhaps they were as startled by my presence as I was by theirs. But as the hours stretched on, those explanations felt less and less convincing. It was well past midnight when I woke again, this time to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was faint at first, like a distant knock echoing through the woods. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, followed by a long pause. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't close, but it was distinct, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand trembling as I switched it on. The interior of the tent was bathed in harsh light, but it did little to calm my nerves. For a long moment, I sat there, straining to hear anything else. The knocks had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt heavier than before. I debated whether to investigate or stay put, paralyzed by indecision. Finally, I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam swept across the clearing, illuminating the trees and bushes in stark relief. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The morning brought little comfort. I packed up camp in a hurry, the uneasy quiet of the previous night pressing down on me. The rhythmic knocking sound still lingered in my mind, each beat replaying like a ghostly echo. I told myself it could have been falling branches or distant woodpeckers, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The calculated intervals, the deliberate pattern felt too unnatural. The trail stretched ahead, narrowing as it carved deeper into the wilderness. Towering trees blocked much of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the ground even in the late morning. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Normally, there'd be birds, rustling leaves, or the chatter of squirrels. Today, though, the woods seemed muted, as if holding its breath. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, my paranoia growing with each step. At first, I laughed at myself for being so jumpy, but then I noticed something that stopped me cold. A single boot print. It was faint, pressed into a patch of soft dirt near the trail. The size and shape told me it wasn't mine, and the edges were too sharp to be old. Someone had walked this way recently. I scanned the surrounding area, my eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The woods were still, but that didn't reassure me. If someone was out here, they were being careful. Too careful. I pressed on, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. The trail became steeper, winding its way through rocky terrain. As the hours passed, I found myself constantly scanning the edges of the path, searching for more prints or signs of disturbance. I thought I caught glimpses of movement, shadows slipping between trees, a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing. By mid-afternoon, I reached a dense section of forest where the trail was barely visible beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. It felt different here, darker. The trees seemed older, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree and wiping the sweat from my brow. That's when I saw it. A structure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was barely visible through the thick undergrowth, but there it was, a crude, makeshift hut built from branches and strips of bark. It looked like it had been there for years, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and debris. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Who would build something like this out here? I approached cautiously, my footsteps soft against the forest floor. The closer I got, the worse the smell became, a pungent mix of rot and mildew. The hut was small, barely tall enough for someone to stand upright inside. Its doorway was little more than a jagged hole, black and yawning like the mouth of some creature. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I peered inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior was empty, save for a few scraps of fabric and what looked like a pile of bones in the corner. Animal bones, I told myself. They had to be. But something about their arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. A cluster of sticks had been tied together and planted in the center of the floor, resembling a crude figure. I backed out quickly, my heart racing. This wasn't just an old hunting shelter or a forgotten camp. Someone had been here, and recently. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. The woods seemed different as I continued my hike, more oppressive. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow darker. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly glancing behind me. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps, soft but distinct, following at a distance. Around sunset, I reached a narrow clearing and decided to set up camp for the night. The thought of spending another night out here filled me with dread, but I had no choice. The next marked trailhead was miles away, and the light was fading fast. I made a small fire, its glow barely cutting through the darkness. Sitting beside it, I tried to calm my nerves, convincing myself that everything I'd experienced was just paranoia. The knocking sounds, the boot print, the hut, it could all be explained. But even as I told myself this, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night brought no peace. It started with the faintest sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. A rustling in the bushes, too rhythmic to be the wind. I froze, my ears straining. Then it came again, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the noise. The beam revealed nothing but trees and shadows. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I scanned the perimeter of the clearing. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was barely more than a silhouette, its features obscured by darkness. It stood motionless, its posture unnervingly stiff. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I shouted again, louder this time. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't move. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and for a split second, the figure seemed to vanish. But when the light dimmed again, it was still there, closer now. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat with my back against the tent, clutching the flashlight in one hand and my pocket knife in the other. The figure didn't reappear, but I could feel its presence, lingering just beyond the edges of the clearing. The hours crawled by, every minute stretched taut with tension. The fire burned low, and the forest seemed to close in around me. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so profound it brought tears to my eyes. But as I packed up my gear, ready to leave this cursed stretch of trail behind, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt near the extinguished fire, there were footprints. The sun climbed higher as I hastily left the clearing behind, pushing myself to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever or whoever had been stalking me. The forest felt more alive now, the quiet of the previous days replaced by the rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. But it wasn't comforting. Every sound made me jump. Every shift in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. I couldn't ignore the tracks I'd found around my campsite. They weren't mine. I'd been too deliberate in keeping my space clear of unnecessary movement. The path ahead wound through a rocky gorge, the walls rising steeply on either side and cutting off much of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of moss and wet stone. I knew this section of the trail was unavoidable. It was the only way to reach the nearest trailhead. As I entered the gorge, the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows cast by the towering cliffs seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping across the ground like dark tendrils. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching against the gravel. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. They echoed faintly off the stone walls, overlapping with my own steps. I stopped abruptly, holding my breath. The sound ceased a moment after I did. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the cliffs and fading into the distance. No response. I scanned the narrow gorge, my eyes darting between the shadows. The only movement was the gentle sway of tree branches far above. Still, the footsteps had been real. I was sure of it. I resumed walking, faster this time. The gorge seemed to stretch endlessly, the cliffs pressing closer with each turn. The footsteps returned, keeping pace with me, but staying just out of sight. My heart raced, every nerve in my body screaming that I was being hunted. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a different sound. A low, guttural growl echoed through the gorge, sending chills down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and wet, almost inhuman. I froze, gripping the handle of my knife tightly. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. The growl came again, louder this time. It seemed to reverberate through the air, surrounding me. I spun around, trying to pinpoint its source, but the narrow gorge amplified the sound, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its form distorted by the dim light. At first, it looked human, tall and thin, its posture hunched, but as it moved closer, the details became clearer, and my stomach turned. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. Long matted hair hung in tangled clumps around its face, obscuring most of its features. But its eyes were black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The thing moved slowly, deliberately, its head cocking to one side as if studying me. "What do you want?" I shouted, the words tumbling out in desperation. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it opened its mouth, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. A sound emerged, not a growl, but something worse. It was a low, guttural chant, the syllables guttural and alien. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the trail, the gravel slipping beneath my boots. The chanting grew louder, echoing through the gorge, chasing me like a living thing. I didn't dare look back. The path began to climb, the steep incline forcing me to slow. My chest heaved with every breath, my vision blurring from the effort. But the chanting didn't stop. It was closer now, a harsh, grating sound that made my skin crawl. I reached a bend in the trail and skidded to a stop. Ahead of me, blocking the path, was another figure. This one was different, smaller, hunched over, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally, the same black eyes staring out from beneath a curtain of stringy hair. It raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at me. I backed away, only to hear the sound of footsteps behind me. They were closing in. The gorge seemed to close around me, the walls pressing in until there was no room to maneuver. The chanting rose to a fever pitch, the voices multiplying, overlapping in a cacophony of sound. I felt trapped, like an animal being herded toward its doom. Desperation took over. I turned and ran toward the cliffs, scrambling up the rocky slope with shaking hands. The stones were slick and sharp, cutting into my palms as I climbed. Below me, the chanting continued, the figures gathering at the base of the cliff. They didn't try to follow. Instead, they stood in a tight cluster, their heads tilting upward in unison. One of them raised its arms, and the chanting stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the noise. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the lead figure let out an ear-splitting shriek, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like it would split my skull. I lost my grip and fell, tumbling down the slope and landing hard on the trail. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself to stand, adrenaline numbing the worst of it. The figures were gone. The trail was empty, the shadows stretching long in the fading light. The forest was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I didn't stop to question it. Limping, I forced myself forward, my only thought to get out of the gorge and away from whatever I had just encountered. The trees seemed to close in around me as the trail twisted and turned, but eventually I saw a break in the cliffs ahead. When I emerged from the gorge, the sky was painted with the warm hues of sunset. The sight should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The woods still felt wrong, the air too still, too heavy. As I made my way toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those black eyes staring back at me. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness fell quickly. My flashlight flickered as I trudged on, the beam of light barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint glow like firelight flickering between the trees. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me as I limped toward the distant glow. My breath was shallow, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flickering light ahead seemed to mock me, its warmth distant and unreachable. It was like a lure, pulling me deeper into the forest. The flashlight in my hand trembled, casting erratic shadows on the ground as I moved forward. My pulse raced in my ears, drowning out all but the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. The glow grew brighter as I neared, revealing the source of the strange light. A campfire, but this was no ordinary campfire. The flames danced unnaturally, their colors shifting between hues of red, green, and blue, flickering and swirling as if the fire itself was alive. It was a fire, yet it didn't seem to burn anything. The ground around it was untouched, the leaves undisturbed. And around it were the figures. I froze, my body rigid with fear. The same creatures I had seen in the gorge were now gathered around the fire, their black eyes glowing in the shifting light. They didn't move, their heads tilted toward the flames, as though they were in a trance. For a moment, I just stood there, my legs too weak to move. What were they doing? What was this place? Suddenly, one of them turned its head, its black eyes locking onto mine. The others followed suit, their gaze turning in unison, and for the first time, I understood. They were waiting for me. A chill ran down my spine. This was no longer a mere chase. This was something else. They weren't trying to kill me. They wanted something. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and without thinking, I bolted. My foot caught on a root, sending me tumbling to the ground. Pain shot through my ribs as I scrambled to my feet, desperate to keep moving. But as I looked back, the figures were following me, not running, but gliding through the underbrush like shadows. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged as I fought against the pain in my leg. I wasn't sure how much farther I could go. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in as though they were pressing me into a corner. The distant glow of the fire was still visible, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the figures were closer, their eyes never leaving me. I could hear their footsteps now, soft but constant, like a persistent echo of my own. I came to a clearing, and there, standing at the edge of the forest, was the trailhead. I wasn't sure how I'd missed it before, but it was there now, my escape. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking as I neared the trailhead. But as I passed the tree line, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The figures were standing at the edge of the clearing, not moving, just watching me. I stopped, my heart in my throat. This was at the moment I either ran or faced whatever was hunting me. But even as I stood there, I knew that I couldn't just keep running forever. I couldn't outrun them. Then, one of them moved. The creature closest to me stepped forward, its long, pale fingers reaching out toward me. For a moment, I thought I was done, for that this was it. But then, to my surprise, it stopped just short of me. Its black eyes locked onto mine, and it tilted its head as though it were studying me. For the first time, I saw something other than hunger in those eyes, something almost curious. The creature's mouth opened, but instead of the guttural chant I'd heard earlier, it spoke. Its voice was a rasping whisper, barely audible over the night air. "You don't belong here," it said. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What did it mean? I didn't belong here. I had no choice but to be here. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The creature didn't move, just watched me with those unsettling eyes. The others remained still, their heads tilted in unison, but they made no move to stop me. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded, my voice shaking. The creature didn't respond, but the other figures, those that had followed me, began to step back. They were leaving me, retreating into the forest as silently as they had arrived. I didn't wait for them to change their minds. I turned and ran, my legs barely holding me up as I pushed myself toward the trailhead. The moment I crossed the threshold of the clearing, I heard the creatures disappear into the forest, their footsteps once again swallowed by the night. I made it to my car without looking back, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the forest. My hands shook on the wheel, my mind unable to process everything that had happened. The road stretched out before me, empty and desolate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Every shadow I passed seemed to hide something. Every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made my heart race. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a hotel and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black eyes staring back at me, and the rasping voice echoing in my mind. I tried to tell myself that I had just imagined it all, some hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that what I had experienced wasn't something that could be dismissed so easily. The creatures had been real, and they were still out there, waiting. Months passed, but the memory of that night lingered. The nightmares faded, but the unease never left. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that no matter where I went, those eyes were following me. I did some research. The woods I had ventured into weren't like any others. They had a history, a dark one. Whispers of strange occurrences, disappearances, and sightings of unearthly creatures had been reported for years, but no one ever spoke of it openly. The forest was, in a sense, a forgotten place, a place where the boundaries between this world and something else were thin. I never went back, but I couldn't help but wonder, were those creatures watching me still? Would they ever leave me alone? Or had they marked me, bound to this world by a connection I couldn't understand? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. I would never, ever venture back into those woods. The passing months didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. The nightmares subsided, but the memories of that night, the sight of the glowing fire, the creatures with their unblinking black eyes, and that voice, rasping in the dark, lingered like a permanent shadow in the back of my mind. No matter how hard I tried to push it out, the images would flash in my mind during the quietest moments, as though they were silently waiting to come rushing back at the most vulnerable times. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound of my own breath, the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. And in those moments, I would sometimes hear a faint rustling, like the sound of leaves stirring in the wind. But I knew better. The sound wasn't the wind. It was them. I couldn't escape it, even in my own home. The woods, the creatures, whatever they were, had followed me in a way I couldn't understand, making my world feel smaller, more fragile. I couldn't even bring myself to go outside at night without a chill running through my bones, my skin prickling as though something unseen was always there, watching, waiting. I found myself questioning everything. Could I ever truly escape from the shadows of that place? The woods were more than just a memory. They were a presence that seemed to grow with time. It was as though I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back to the way things once were. The peace I had before that night, before everything changed, felt like a distant dream, and it became harder and harder to tell if I had ever truly been free of it. As the years passed, I did my best to go on with my life. I worked, I met people, and I tried to move forward. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just behind me. The unease never fully faded. I had tried to rationalize everything, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. What I had experienced was real, and it had left a mark on me that would never fade. There were moments, though, when the fear became too much to bear. I would be driving down a long stretch of road, the headlights casting long shadows against the trees, and I'd feel my heartbeat quicken as I glanced at the dark woods that bordered the road. The forest was always there, always waiting. It was as if it was still holding its breath, waiting for me to return, waiting for me to come back to it. One day, on a whim, I decided to visit the town near the forest. I hadn't been there in years, but I wanted to see if anything had changed. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I felt the need to return, to confront whatever lingering doubt I had about that night. When I arrived, I wandered through the small, quiet streets of the town. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the trees towered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. As I passed a local diner, I decided to go inside. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might know something about the forest or the strange occurrences I had encountered. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A few locals sat in booths, but none of them seemed to take much notice of me as I slid into a seat at the counter. The waitress, an older woman with graying hair, gave me a polite but distant smile as she handed me a menu. After a few minutes of silence, I asked, "Has there been anything strange in the woods lately? You know, strange sightings or—" The woman's smile faltered for just a moment. "The woods," she said, her voice suddenly quiet, "are best left alone. You should never wander too far in there." Her words sent a chill through me, and for a moment I thought about asking her more, about pressing her for answers. But before I could speak again, she turned away, as though she had already said everything she intended to. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, I passed by a small local shop and noticed a dusty, old book on a shelf near the back. The title caught my eye, "The History of the Dark Forest." I didn't know what compelled me to pick it up, but something about it felt familiar, like a nagging pull that I couldn't resist. As I flipped through the pages, I found stories and old reports about the very woods I had ventured into, stories about missing hikers, strange disappearances, and the occasional strange creature sighting. But what struck me the most was a passage in the back of the book, one that described an ancient legend about a place where the boundaries between this world and another were thin. It spoke of beings, creatures that could slip through the veil between worlds, seeking those who wandered too far into the forest. Those who were chosen, the book said, would never truly leave. My stomach dropped as I read those words. It all made sense now. I left the town the next morning, but the unease never left me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had read in that book, about the creatures and the strange events. The forest had been calling to me in a way I couldn't understand, and now I knew why. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, no matter how hard I tried to escape it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees were there, dark and imposing, stretching toward the sky. And in the distance, just at the edge of the woods. I could have sworn I saw something moving just beyond the trees. But I didn't stop. Because deep down, I knew that the forest would always be there, waiting, and it would never truly let me go. This story takes place a few years ago when I was traveling for work. I had always enjoyed the thrill of staying in new places, but it was this particular hotel that would change my outlook on travel forever. It wasn't the most luxurious place I'd stayed in, but it was functional, just a regular hotel with a check-in desk, some average amenities, and clean rooms. My job had me traveling all over, often staying in places that I didn't know much about. It was routine, a life filled with back-to-back flights, layovers, and hotel rooms that could have been anywhere in the world. You know the type: quiet, plain, and a little too sterile. I'd been in this city for a couple of days for business meetings. The morning had been filled with conferences, and by evening, I found myself exhausted. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the night air was crisp as I made my way back to the hotel. I was looking forward to a hot meal and a long, uninterrupted night of sleep. The hotel itself was located on a quiet street, tucked between other older buildings that had a slightly worn-down charm. Its exterior had the look of a structure that had seen better days, though it wasn't immediately noticeable, just a few cracks in the bricks, the paint starting to fade in certain areas. But overall, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. I checked in at the front desk, and the receptionist, an older man with a weathered face, handed me a key to room 212, located on the second floor. He didn't say much beyond the usual, "Enjoy your stay." I took the key and made my way up, passing the small lobby that was sparsely decorated. The hotel felt quiet, too quiet. But maybe that was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the button for the second floor. It wasn't the nicest room, but it wasn't terrible either. The walls were painted a dull beige, the bed was large enough to collapse into, and the bathroom was small, with a faded mirror. The TV was one of those older models, with a few fuzzy channels. But I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to unpack. All I wanted was sleep. It was a typical night, the kind where your mind slowly slips away into slumber. The room was calm, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the air conditioning. It was easy to forget that this wasn't home, that this was just another stop on the endless travel schedule. But in hindsight, I should have trusted my gut when it told me something felt off. It was the little things, the strange creaks in the floorboards, the faint tapping from somewhere above. Things that would have easily been dismissed in any other context, but not here. Not now. I had been in the room for maybe an hour when the first odd thing happened. It was subtle at first, a flicker of the lights. Nothing too alarming, just a brief, almost imperceptible dimming. It happened again shortly after, but I convinced myself it was just a fault in the old wiring. After all, the hotel was hardly new, and I wasn't about to make a fuss over something so trivial. So I turned my attention back to the muted TV, trying to relax, but my mind kept drifting to the odd feeling that had settled over me. The air in the room felt heavy, and despite the cold air conditioning, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. As the night drew on, I tried to ignore the feeling, convincing myself it was just the fatigue. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was lingering in the shadows, just out of reach. The flicker of the lights earlier that evening had seemed like a mere electrical issue. But as the night wore on, things began to feel different, heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. The stillness of the night was broken by subtle, barely perceptible sounds, tiny things at first. A soft tapping, like fingernails on wood, echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the walls. I tried to dismiss it as the old structure settling or the air conditioning kicking on, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I turned off the TV, hoping the quiet would help me shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept into the room. The faint tapping continued, almost rhythmic, as if something was trying to get my attention. I couldn't pinpoint the source. It didn't sound like it was coming from the next room or the hallway. It was as if the sound was coming from above, though that didn't make sense. The ceiling was smooth, undisturbed. No pipes, no ventilation ducts, just the unbroken surface of the drywall. I stared at the shadows, hoping that if I ignored it long enough, it would stop. But it didn't. It was like the room itself was alive, and I was the only one left in it to bear witness. I got out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a jolt. As I moved to the window, I tried to focus on something normal, anything to distract me from the strange sensation creeping along my spine. The streetlights outside cast a soft glow into the room, but beyond that, there was nothing but the night, dark and silent. The tapping stopped suddenly. I froze. That eerie silence, the kind that only seems to grow louder when there's nothing left to hear, filled the room. I couldn't help but feel like something was standing just out of sight, watching me. My breath quickened, but I took a deep one to steady myself. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. Nothing more. I returned to the bed, but before I could lie down, the tapping started again. This time, it was different, more insistent, like something was desperately trying to get through. The noise was coming from the ceiling above me. My heart began to race as I tried to rationalize it. The hotel wasn't exactly new, or maybe it was just some old pipes in the walls or the roof. But even as I told myself this, I knew something wasn't right. I had spent enough nights in hotels to recognize the normal sounds of settling and the hum of a building at rest. This wasn't it. This was something else. I stood there, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering what I should do. It felt like time had slowed down. My mind raced through every possibility, but none of them explained what I was hearing or feeling. The air around me was thick, almost stifling, and my pulse echoed in my ears. My body was tense, like I was preparing for something I couldn't see. Then, as if the universe was playing some cruel trick, the tapping stopped once again. The silence returned. I almost let out a relieved sigh, but then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, rising from the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words. It was too soft, too distorted, like a voice through a thick fog. It wasn't the wind. There was no draft, and the air conditioning had been off for a while now. The room felt unnaturally still, but the sound was there, clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. I didn't move. I just stood there, my body frozen in place, straining to hear more, but the whisper faded just as quickly as it had come. My heart was racing in my chest, thumping so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out every other sound. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the front desk? Was this just an old building doing what old buildings do? I debated for a moment, but the thought of calling down there and sounding crazy talking about whispers and tapping noises stopped me. The last thing I wanted was for the staff to think I was some paranoid guest. I had no explanation for what was happening, but that didn't make it any less real. I decided to check the door, thinking maybe it had been the wind or someone walking by. I walked cautiously toward it, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. But before I could touch it, the tapping returned, this time louder and faster, almost frantic. It was like something was scrambling above me, a frantic clawing against the ceiling. My hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen with uncertainty. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical reason, some rational explanation. I was in a hotel. Hotels were full of old pipes, creaky floors, and noisy air conditioning. Nothing out of the ordinary. But still, the sounds persisted. Tap, tap, tap. Faster now, like something trying to break through the ceiling. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. I had no choice but to open the door to see what was going on. Maybe there was something in the hallway. But as soon as I twisted the handle and cracked open the door, the sound stopped. I stepped out cautiously, looking both ways down the quiet corridor. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of disturbance. Just the same pale carpet, the same quiet hum of the hotel air conditioning. The hallway was empty. My heart rate slowed slightly, but the strange sense of dread that had taken hold of me refused to let go. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, suffocating in its heaviness. I stepped back into the room and closed the door behind me. The tapping, the whispers, they were gone for now, but the tension in the air didn't lift. It lingered. My mind kept replaying the events over and over. I kept thinking back to those small, inexplicable things, the lights flickering, the whispers, the tapping. They were so subtle, but there was no mistaking it now. Something was wrong with that room. As I sat back down on the bed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, I wondered if I should just leave. But my exhaustion was overpowering, and my rational mind tried to convince me that it was all in my head. I lay back down, pulling the blankets tightly around me. Sleep was something I needed, something I couldn't afford to put off. But sleep didn't come easily that night. No matter how much I tried to calm my thoughts, the images of tapping, whispers, and strange noises echoed in my mind. And just as I was about to drift off, the tapping returned. Louder this time. The nights that followed grew progressively stranger. At first, I thought maybe it had just been a one-off. The sort of thing that could be explained away by nerves, tiredness, or some natural anomaly in an old building. But with each passing night, the unsettling occurrences became more frequent, more pronounced. It wasn't long before I could no longer ignore the overwhelming sense that something in the hotel room was wrong. It started small. At first, there was just the occasional flickering of the lights, or the soft creak of the floorboards when there was no one there to make them creak. But as I spent more nights in that room, I started to notice things I couldn't explain away so easily. Objects would shift, ever so slightly, in the night. A glass of water I left on the table would be moved to the edge, a little further from where I had placed it. The bed would be just a bit off center when I woke up, the pillows rearranged as though someone had lain there in my absence. The first night it happened, I thought I was just being paranoid. But when it happened again on the second night, then the third, I couldn't pretend any longer. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the building settling, but deep down, I knew better. There was something else at work here, something beyond my understanding. One night, as I was sitting at the desk, reviewing some notes, the light above me flickered and buzzed. I could hear a soft thump coming from behind the wall, like something heavy had been dropped or shifted. I froze, my pen poised midair, my hand trembling slightly. I had been in this room for days now, and this was the first time I'd heard anything like that. It wasn't just a creak or a groan from the structure, it sounded deliberate. I stood up cautiously and walked over to the wall. The sound had come from behind it, but there was no clear source. No pipes running along that wall, no furniture near it. Nothing that could explain that sudden thud. I leaned closer to the wall, my ear almost pressing against it, listening intently for any other signs. The room felt too quiet, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. A few seconds passed, and then a second thump echoed from the same spot. My heart pounded, and my instincts screamed at me to leave the room, to run. But curiosity, stupid, reckless curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. I reached for the door handle, but just as my fingers brushed it, there was a sudden, sharp knock on the door. I jerked back, startled. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. No one had knocked on my door before. It was well past midnight, and the hallways outside were dark and still. Whoever it was, they were persistent. The knock came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, I opened the door, only to find an empty hallway. The silence was deafening. There were no signs of anyone, no movement, just the dim glow of a single light down at the end of the corridor. It was as though whoever had knocked had vanished into thin air. I stepped out, scanning the hallway, but there was nothing. I returned to the room, my skin prickling, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I shut the door behind me, and for a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what to do next. I looked around the room, the furniture, the walls. Everything seemed normal, too calm. But that's when I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen before. The mirror on the far wall was slightly askew. I approached it cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange sense of dread welling up inside me. The mirror, which had been perfectly aligned before, now appeared to have shifted, tilted slightly. I reached up and adjusted it, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection, behind me, there was something moving. I spun around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. But there was nothing. The room was still, empty. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse racing. The reflection remained unchanged. It was almost as if the movement I had seen in the mirror had never happened. But I knew what I had seen. The fleeting figure, the shadow that seemed to pass just behind me, was real. I stood there, staring at the mirror, my mind reeling. How could I have seen that? Was I imagining things? I ran my hand over my face, trying to shake off the fear that had taken hold of me. But the sensation of being watched wouldn't leave. It was like the room itself was alive, and every time I tried to look away, it pulled me back in. From that point on, the occurrences only grew more intense. Each day I spent in that room felt like a battle against something I couldn't see, but I knew it was there. The taps, the knocks, the whispers, all of them became more frequent, more insistent, until I could no longer tell the difference between the real world and the strange world that seemed to be bleeding into my perception. One night, the light above me flickered out completely. I wasn't even startled at first. I had grown accustomed to the odd electrical issues by now. But this time, when I went to switch it back on, the bulb didn't respond. The room was plunged into total darkness. I fumbled around the desk, searching for my phone, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the lamp base. But the phone wasn't there. In fact, none of my belongings were where I had left them. The bed had been shifted again. The pillows were stacked unevenly, and the blanket was twisted, as though someone had been sleeping in it. I rushed to the door, my hand fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked from the inside. Panic set in. I could feel it building, the walls closing in. I backed away from the door, my breath quickening. Then, from behind me, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving from one side of the room to the other. I turned sharply, but there was no one there. And that's when I heard it. The softest whisper, just barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. "I'm here?" I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was not mine. It wasn't anyone's I recognized. It was low, guttural, a voice that sent a chill straight through me. And in that moment, I knew whatever was happening in that room wasn't something I could escape. The next night, everything escalated. I had decided, foolishly or perhaps out of some twisted sense of defiance, that I couldn't just sit in that room, waiting for something to happen. I had to confront whatever it was. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I didn't believe that anymore. The movements, the sounds, the whispers, they were real. And if they were real, I had to know what I was up against. I locked the door behind me and turned off the lights, shrouding myself in darkness. I could hear my heartbeat in the silence, thudding in my chest as I stood in the center of the room. The air felt thick, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to occur. Then, out of nowhere, it started. At first, there was nothing more than a soft creak in the floorboards, the kind you might hear if someone were walking across the room behind you. But this wasn't a simple sound. It was deliberate. Heavy, dragging steps that seemed to circle the room, coming from all directions at once. I turned in panic, but there was no one there. My breath quickened, my pulse rising. I could feel the walls pressing in on me. the air too heavy, too suffocating. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it, the same voice I had heard earlier, that low, guttural whisper. "I'm here." I spun around, my body trembling with terror. My eyes darted across the room, but it was empty. Yet the voice, the presence, was so strong, so overwhelming, that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin crawled, goosebumps rising in waves across my arms. Then, suddenly, everything went dark. The lights above me flickered and sputtered out once again. I stumbled backward, my hands grasping at nothing but air. I couldn't see, couldn't move, as the room seemed to close in around me, the shadows swallowing me whole. In the darkness, the footsteps returned, this time much louder, much closer. I could feel the floor beneath me vibrate with each step. Something brushed against my arm, something cold, something solid, like a hand. I gasped, stumbling away, but the contact was gone as quickly as it had come. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. I fumbled for my phone, trying to use the light from it to navigate, but the screen flickered and died before I could see anything. I felt trapped. There was no way out, no escape. Then the whispers grew louder. "I'm here." The words repeated, growing more frantic, more desperate, until they seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, to breathe, and I could feel something know, someone pressing in on me, moving through the shadows. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pushing down on me. In a blind panic, I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking as I turned the handle. But the door wouldn't open. It was locked again, just like before. I screamed, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence of the room. But my voice was swallowed up, absorbed by the darkness. And then it came into focus. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of my sight, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker or a shadow that didn't belong, but as I turned toward it, the form became clearer. A figure! A person or something that resembled a person was standing in the corner, cloaked in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and stretched out, as if it didn't quite belong in this space. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but the faint outline of a face could be seen, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It was watching me. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. My legs felt weak, my body frozen in place as the figure slowly, methodically, moved toward me. Its footsteps didn't make a sound, as though it was gliding across the floor, but I could feel it drawing nearer with every passing second. The whispers intensified, now forming words that were barely intelligible. "Leave. Now." I could hear the desperation in its voice, but the words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a command, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, suffocating me, as if the very air in the room had thickened. I screamed again, this time louder, more frantic, but the figure didn't stop. It reached out, its long, thin fingers brushing against my arm, cold as ice. The contact sent a shock of terror through me, and I instinctively recoiled, but it was too late. It spoke again, its voice now a growl, a low rasp that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "You should never have come here." And in that moment, I understood. The hotel room, the whispers, the shifting objects, the presence, it wasn't just haunting me. It was trying to make me understand something. I was being tested, toyed with, pushed to the edge of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, held in place by the force of its presence. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure vanished. The room was silent again, the oppressive presence gone. I stood there, trembling, drenched in cold sweat, unable to process what had just happened. Had I been dreaming? Was it real? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Something in that room had made its presence known, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to forget it. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. My legs ached from the effort, But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The pounding in my chest was deafening, and my breath was ragged, burning in my lungs as I barreled through the narrow hallways of the hotel, desperately searching for an exit, for anything that could get me away from the room. I didn't dare to look back. When I finally reached the lobby, I didn't even pause to check in at the front desk or speak to anyone. I had no time. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away from that place as humanly possible. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely grasp the door handle. But somehow I managed to pull it open, and the cold night air hit me like a shock, the familiar sting of the wind making me feel alive again, even if just for a moment. I stepped out into the street, but I didn't stop there. I kept walking. My feet moved on their own, carrying me away from the hotel and into the unknown. I didn't care where I went anymore. I didn't care about anything other than putting miles between me and that cursed room. The further I walked, the more I realized just how much my mind had shattered. I was numb, every step feeling like it took me further away from my own reality, further from the man I used to be. I didn't know if I had truly escaped or if I had just gotten lost in my own mind. I tried to reach out to the hotel to find some answers, but the staff insisted that they had no knowledge of anything strange happening in room 315. They even seemed confused when I asked them about the previous guests. The receptionist claimed the room was empty for weeks, the hotel having just undergone renovations. I don't know why they told me that, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The more I dug, the more I realized just how much I didn't know. My inquiries were met with silence, and I began to feel like I was chasing ghosts. No one in the town had any information about the hotel's history, and when I asked around about the rumors I had heard about the place, I only received blank stares or hesitant, uneasy answers. I decided to stop asking. I tried to move on. I tried to forget the experience, to erase the nightmares that plagued my sleep. I kept myself busy, surrounded by people who didn't know about my ordeal, my fear. But it didn't work. The unease never truly left me. I started to avoid hotels, started to sleep with the lights on. Every strange noise, every shadow in the corner of my eye made my heart race, my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. I went back to work, saw friends, and eventually tried to date again. But even in the midst of those moments, there was always that underlying unease. I never spoke of what happened to anyone. No one would believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? The damage had already been done. The room had changed me, twisted something inside of me that I could never undo. One night, a few months after the incident, I was walking through the city, lost in thought, when I passed an old hotel. The familiar sight of the faded sign caught my eye, and I froze. My stomach dropped. It was the same hotel. I hadn't realized where I had walked to, but there it was, its shadow looming over me like an old friend I didn't want to meet again. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I instinctively turned to leave. But something stopped me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark windows, the cracked paint, the worn-out facade that I had once stepped into so carelessly. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to walk closer. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to forget it all. But I couldn't. I reached the entrance, and to my surprise, the door was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, the old hinges creaking in protest. The lobby was empty, quiet. The air was thick, just like it had been that night. I stood there, wondering if I was imagining the sense of foreboding that seemed to fill the room. But no, it was real. I walked toward the front desk, half expecting the same receptionist to be there. But the desk was unmanned, as though the hotel had been abandoned for years. The check-in counter was empty, the bell unused and gathering dust. The building was dead, lifeless. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. And then I heard it. The softest whisper, just barely audible, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. "I'm here." My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe as the sound lingered in the air. I knew it was the same voice, the same presence I had encountered in that cursed room. The whispers were here again, calling me, beckoning me to step closer, to enter the room one last time. But I knew better. I ran. I ran out of the hotel, back onto the street, and this time I didn't stop. I didn't look back. As I walked away, my heart pounding, I realized that I would never truly be free from that place. The hotel, that room, and whatever haunted it would always be with me, just waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I never went back, but I could never forget. And maybe, just maybe, it was better that way. Because sometimes, the things we leave behind are the things that follow us forever. I walked away from that hotel and never looked back, or at least, that's what I thought. It's been years now. I've settled into a routine, a life that feels almost normal again. I've managed to push the memories deep into the back of my mind, where they're buried beneath layers of mundane concerns and fleeting moments of happiness. But every once in a while, a sound, a feeling, or even the wrong kind of silence will drag me back, just for a second. And when that happens, I'm reminded of the room, the whispers, and the heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to cling to that cursed place. I can't escape it. I've tried to explain the experience to people, but I've learned the hard way that some things don't translate well into words. The looks of skepticism, the polite smiles people just don't understand. It's easy to dismiss these things as tricks of the mind, as some kind of dream or nightmare that gets tangled up in your memory. But the truth is, I felt it. I experienced it. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that it's still with me. That room, the way it felt, the way it twisted time and reality around itself, wasn't something I could just walk away from. It was as if the walls of that space were bound to my soul, leaving a mark that will never fade. And so, every so often, I'll find myself thinking about it, and then I'll feel that nagging sensation again. It's not physical, but it's there, somewhere just beneath the surface, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. A constant reminder that I was part of something that I don't fully understand. I used to be able to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of fear, exhaustion, and the weight of too many late nights. But even now, sitting in the quiet of my apartment with nothing but the soft hum of city life outside my window, I wonder if I truly ever left. Maybe the room didn't just live in that hotel. Maybe it followed me. I've heard stories from others since, strange tales that mirror my own experiences. Some are vague and unsettling, others chillingly specific. A person hears a whisper in an empty room. A photograph shows something that shouldn't be there. A shadow moves in a corner where there should be none. Sometimes, the stories are too much like my own, too similar in their essence, for me to believe they're mere coincidences. And I can't help but wonder, how many others have stood where I stood, feeling the same oppressive weight, hearing the same chilling whispers? It's easy to convince yourself that you're crazy, that the mind can conjure up monsters when it's pushed to its limit. But there are times late at night, when the world is quiet, and everything feels just a little too still, when I wonder if I was never meant to leave that room. I've moved on in many ways. I've rebuilt my life, reconnected with people who have no idea of the dark, twisted thing I experienced. I've gone to different hotels, stayed in different rooms, but I always make sure to leave before nightfall. I've learned to sleep with the lights on, to keep my back to the door, and to never, ever look at a hotel room the same way again. I don't know what was in that room. I don't know why it chose me or what it wanted. Maybe it was something ancient, a force that had always been there, waiting for someone to stumble into its grasp. Maybe it was just a twisted figment of my imagination, a terrifying illusion brought on by stress, sleep deprivation, or a million other factors. But no matter how many times I try to rationalize it, no matter how many years pass, one thing remains true. I will never forget. Sometimes I still hear the whispers. Not often, but enough to remind me that I'm never truly alone. That room, whatever it was, may be gone, but the feeling it left behind lingers. And every so often, just as I'm starting to feel safe again, The echoes of that experience rise up, pulling me back into the past. So as I sit here, writing this, I reflect on everything I've been through, on everything that's happened since that fateful night. I've tried to move on, to put it behind me, but some things leave scars that never heal. Some rooms, some experiences, are too much to forget. It was just an ordinary day. Well, at least, that's what I thought at the time. I had no idea that my life, and my perception of reality, would be forever altered after what happened that evening. The evening I set foot in the old hospital. The place had been abandoned for years. It stood like a ghost in the heart of the city, a relic from a time long gone. I was working in the area, doing some repairs for a local construction company. We had been tasked with clearing out the old, run-down building to make way for a new project. No one knew exactly what had gone on inside that hospital, and honestly, no one seemed to care anymore. It had been empty for over a decade, its walls crumbling, the windows shattered, and the interior left to rot. I had heard whispers about the place. Some people claimed it was haunted. Others swore that strange noises could be heard at night. But those were just stories, right? Just the kind of rumors you hear when a building has been left to decay. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. I was a man of logic and reason. There had to be an explanation for everything, and I intended to find it. The crew I worked with was a mixed group of guys, none of whom were particularly keen on venturing into that building. The stories of its dark past had made them nervous, but we all needed the work. So we went in together, armed with flashlights, crowbars, and an unspoken understanding that this was just a job. I'll never forget the first time I saw the hospital up close. It was late in the afternoon when we arrived. The sky had already begun to fade into twilight, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The building was massive, with high, imposing walls and a broken sign hanging above the entrance. The windows were mostly boarded up, but I could see a faint glow coming from within. The wind moaned through the cracks in the structure, creating an eerie atmosphere. "Ready to get started?" one of my colleagues asked, his voice tense. I nodded, trying to ignore the unease creeping into my stomach. I wasn't afraid. No, I wasn't going to let my mind get the better of me. It was just an old building. That's all it was. We made our way inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath our feet as we explored the dark hallways. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. The farther we ventured into the hospital, the more I could feel something was off. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the leaking pipes. But that was just the setting. Nothing more. Nothing supernatural. We spent hours going from room to room, clearing debris and preparing the building for demolition. But with each passing minute, the sense of unease grew. The place was just too still. It was as if something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my work, but I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was an old elevator at the far end of the hall that seemed to be stuck on the top floor. We had to get the doors open to inspect it, and that's when things started to take a turn. I had my back to the elevator when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the corridor. I froze, my heart racing. The other guys heard it too. We all turned, expecting to see one of our crew members standing in the doorway. But no one was there. Just the empty hallway stretching out into the darkness. One of the guys laughed nervously. "Must be the wind," he said, trying to brush it off. But I wasn't convinced. I don't know why, but something about it felt wrong. Too wrong. And that was only the beginning. The deeper we went into the building, the more the unsettling feeling grew. I tried to rationalize it, but the hospital had a way of making you question everything you thought you knew. The first incident occurred just as we were finishing up for the day. We had been working for hours, and the sun had long since disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving the hospital shrouded in darkness. The only light we had was from our flashlights, their beams cutting through the thick dust and shadows. The sound of our boots scraping against the floor echoed off the walls, adding to the oppressive silence of the building. We were about to head towards the front entrance when it happened. It started with a soft, almost imperceptible noise. A faint scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor, coming from one of the nearby rooms. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the old building settling. But the noise persisted, and it was too consistent, too deliberate to be anything as simple as that. I turned to my colleagues. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. One of them, a guy named Charlie, was already looking in the direction of the noise. "Yeah, I heard it," he said, his voice tight. He had a nervous edge to it that I hadn't noticed before. "Maybe it's a rat or something," I suggested, trying to rationalize it. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air thick with tension. The scratching sound continued, now louder, more distinct. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, near the old storage room. I wasn't sure why, but something in my gut told me we shouldn't go toward it. But then again, we had a job to do, and we couldn't let a strange noise stop us. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was beating faster than usual. Charlie looked hesitant, glancing around the dark hallway. "Are you sure? We could just leave it. We're almost done anyway." But I wasn't going to back down. It was just a noise, right? There had to be a reasonable explanation. So, we made our way down the hallway, our footsteps echoing louder with each step. The air grew colder as we approached the storage room. My flashlight flickered, and I had to tap it a few times to get the beam steady. The closer we got, the more the scratching sound seemed to grow, as though something was clawing at the walls from within. Charlie stood behind me, his face pale, and the others followed closely. I pushed open the door to the storage room, the old hinges creaking in protest. The room was empty, except for a few rusted shelves and a pile of old boxes pushed against the far wall. Nothing out of the ordinary. "See? Nothing," I said, trying to reassure everyone. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the sudden, overwhelming sense that we weren't alone. I couldn't explain it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up and my skin crawled. There was something off about the room. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the space itself was holding its breath. I looked around, my flashlight scanning every corner. That's when I saw a small, old-fashioned rocking chair tucked in the far corner. I hadn't noticed it when we first entered, but now that it was in my line of sight, I couldn't look away. The chair was rocking, not violently, but with a slow, steady motion. Back and forth, as if someone or something was sitting in it. I froze. Charlie, who had been standing near the doorway, let out a small gasp. "That wasn't rocking before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't argue with him. I had seen the room just seconds earlier, and there was no way that chair was moving on its own. The air seemed to grow even colder, and I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and rapid in the stillness. "Maybe it's just a draft?" I suggested weakly, though I didn't believe it for a second. But Charlie wasn't buying it. His eyes were wide, and I could tell he was starting to panic. "No way," he said, stepping back towards the door. "This is messed up, man." I swallowed hard, trying to regain my composure. This wasn't like me. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but there was something undeniably wrong about this room, about the chair, and about the way the temperature had dropped so suddenly. We all stood there in silence, the rocking chair creaking slowly with every movement. It was like the room was waiting, holding its breath. My eyes darted around, looking for any logical explanation, but all I saw were the same shadows and old, decaying shelves. Nothing made sense. Then, out of nowhere, the scratching sound came again, this time, louder, closer. It was coming from behind one of the shelves, but I couldn't see anything. "Okay, that's it. I'm done," Charlie said, his voice trembling. Without another word, he turned and bolted out of the room, practically tripping over his own feet in his haste. The rest of us weren't far behind. We rushed out of the room and into the hallway, the door slamming shut behind us with a heavy thud. We stood there, breathing hard, all of us too shaken to speak at first. "What the hell was that?" one of the others finally asked, his voice unsteady. "I don't know," I admitted, my mind racing. "But I've never seen anything like that before." We tried to brush it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We couldn't ignore what we had just witnessed. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the scratching noise started again. This time, it was coming from the opposite direction, further down the hallway. But there was no way anyone could have moved that quickly, and there was no one else in the building. One of the guys suggested we check the security footage, but we all knew deep down that no footage would ever explain what had just happened. We weren't sure if we should keep going or call it a night. No one said anything for a long moment. We all just stood there, frozen in place, not daring to move. Something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong with that place, and we all knew it now. After the incident with the rocking chair, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed to change. There was a heaviness in the air, a constant sense of being watched. It wasn't just me anymore, everyone felt it. Every step we took echoed unnervingly in the silence, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides, making the building feel smaller, more confined. It started with little things that didn't seem all that important at first. But over time, those little things piled up until it became impossible to ignore. The lights would flicker sporadically, casting the hallway in a stuttering glow. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain areas, and we'd all exchange nervous glances as we shivered in the unnatural cold. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of our eyes, vanishing whenever we turned to look directly at them. One evening, we were gathered in the break room, trying to relax after a long shift. The small kitchen area buzzed with the sound of the refrigerator, and the flickering light above our heads gave the room a faint hum. But the tension was palpable. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us just outside the door. "I don't know about you guys, but I don't feel right about this place anymore," said Charlie, his voice low. He was leaning against the table, tapping his fingers restlessly. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that was shared by all of us. "I don't think it's just you," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. "We've all felt it, haven't we?" A few of the others nodded in agreement, but no one said anything more. We all knew what we were talking about, but we couldn't put it into words. It was like the very air in the building had become thick, suffocating, and every creak of the old structure seemed to echo through the silence in a way that made our skin crawl. We had to do something. We couldn't just keep ignoring the strange events, hoping they'd go away on their own. But we were all a little afraid to be the one to say it out loud, afraid to admit that there was something truly wrong with the hospital. But as the days passed, the strangeness grew more frequent, more intense. It started when we noticed something odd in the supply closet. It wasn't anything major, just a small detail. We'd all been in and out of that room countless times, but one day, the contents of a box on the top shelf were completely rearranged. The items inside were scattered haphazardly, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry. No one remembered touching the box, and no one had any explanation for it. Then, the sound started. First, it was just the occasional scratching or tapping in the walls. It could have been pipes or something mechanical, but when it started happening more and more often at all hours of the day and night, it became impossible to ignore. The noises were coming from places we couldn't explain. Sometimes they seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, other times from the walls, always just out of reach of our sight. One night, As we were walking through the hallway near the old patient rooms, we heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, just like the sound of fingernails on wood. It came from behind one of the closed doors. We all froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. The hospital had been abandoned for years. No one was supposed to be there. We approached the door cautiously. I was the first to reach for the handle, but as my hand touched the cold metal, I hesitated. Something in my gut told me not to open it, but I couldn't back out now. I had to know what was behind that door. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, the only light coming from our flashlights. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered heavily in the air. There was nothing in the room that should have been moving, nothing that could have been making the tapping sound. The walls were covered in old, peeling paint, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. But then, we saw it. In the corner of the room, a small rocking chair was gently swaying back and forth, just like the one in the storage room. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't happening again. Not here. Not now. Is that moving? One of the others whispered, his voice trembling. His eyes were fixed on the chair, wide with fear. Before I could answer, we heard a sound sharp, like a shriek. It came from somewhere deep within the hospital, echoing down the halls and vibrating the very walls around us. We spun around, instinctively looking toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just empty hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The air seemed oppressed and around us, thick and oppressive, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. I could hear my pulse in my ears, fast and erratic. I wanted to leave, to run out of there and never come back, but I couldn't. None of us could. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. We stumbled around, trying to find our bearings, but everything felt wrong. The air was colder, heavier. The very walls seemed to close in around us. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I finally turned it on, it flickered and died, leaving us in pitch-black silence. That's when the whispers started. They were soft at first, barely audible over the sound of our breathing. But then they grew louder, clearer. Low voices that seemed to come from all directions, as if the building itself was speaking to us. But there was no one else here, no one alive. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body felt frozen, trapped in this dark, suffocating place. The others were just as terrified as I was, but none of us dared to move. Then the lights flickered back on, and in that split second of illumination, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the hallway, standing just outside of the light's reach, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. It was watching us. But when the light flickered again, the figure was gone. We stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been, frozen in terror. But we couldn't stay here. We couldn't stay in this place any longer. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that the hospital wasn't going to let us leave so easily. The sounds continued. The tapping, the whispers, the oppressive feeling that something was lurking just beyond our sight. The further we moved through the building, the worse it got. It was like the hospital was alive, feeding off our fear. As we made our way back to the exit, we didn't speak. There was nothing to say. None of us could explain what was happening, and none of us knew if we'd make it out of there alive. But we couldn't stop now. We had to find out what was happening, what was really going on in this cursed place. It was the only way we'd ever be able to sleep again. The tension that had been building up for days reached a boiling point when we decided, almost by accident, to explore the deepest parts of the hospital. I had always tried to keep a level head after all. I was a professional. But the longer I stayed in that place, the more the creeping dread gnawed at my resolve. That night, as we made our way deeper into the abandoned corridors, it felt as though the building itself was aware of us, tracking our every move, tightening its grip around us, like a predator circling its prey. None of us had planned on going so far into the hospital. The place was massive, more like a labyrinth than a simple medical facility. Every turn, every hallway, every room seemed to look the same, and the further we went, the more I started to feel like we were lost. But something darker pushed us forward. I'll never forget the moment we reached the old elevator shaft. The hospital had been closed down for years, but the elevator still stood, its doors sealed tight, rusted and old. There was a strange, oppressive aura around it, a lingering sense that this was the heart of the evil that had taken root in this building. None of us spoke. We simply stood there, staring at the elevator doors, knowing that whatever had happened here all those years ago, whatever was keeping the hospital haunted, was tied to this place. "Do you feel that?" Charlie whispered, his voice low and shaky. I didn't need to answer. We all felt it, the heavy, suffocating presence in the air, the way the walls seemed to pulse with unseen energy, like the building was alive. It was like stepping into the mouth of some unseen creature. The fear was overwhelming, as if something was waiting to spring on us at any moment. That's when the sounds began again. At first, it was just the faint creaking of the elevator doors, as though something was pushing against them from the inside. Then came the tapping, louder now, more insistent. We all jumped, hearts racing as the noise grew in intensity, rattling our nerves like never before. Charlie took a step back, but I couldn't move. I felt drawn to the elevator, as if it was calling me. The others seemed to be frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear, watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. I reached for the elevator doors, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold, rusted metal. With a deep breath, I pushed them open. The darkness inside the elevator shaft was absolute. It felt like the space beyond was infinite, like there was no end to the darkness. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. What caught my attention first was the faint, almost imperceptible movement at the back of the elevator. There, in the far corner, I saw someone standing still. For a split second, I thought I was imagining things. But then the figure shifted. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure was tall and thin, with long, matted hair hanging loosely around its face, obscuring its features. But what really made my stomach turn wasn't the person, it was the way the figure seemed to be. Waiting, standing there, unmoving, watching us. Then I heard the voice. It was a soft, rasping whisper, barely audible over the thundering of my pulse in my ears. "Help me." The words were so faint, so barely a breath, but they seemed to echo in the pit of my stomach like an undeniable truth. That's when the other sounds began to make sense, the tapping, the shrieking, the whispers. It was all connected. The figure in the elevator wasn't just some random ghost. It was a soul trapped in this place, forever caught between the world of the living and the dead, desperately trying to communicate with us. Before I could react, the figure moved again, this time toward us. Charlie screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed down the hall. But it wasn't the fear in his voice that struck me the hardest. It was the look in his eyes as he turned and fled. It was the look of someone who had lost all sense of control, someone who had witnessed something so horrifying that their mind could no longer function in a normal way. "Run!" he shouted. "Run!" But it was too late. The figure had already begun to move, its steps slow but deliberate, dragging its feet as if weighed down by something unseen. It didn't speak again, but the air around it seemed to throb with a strange, malignant energy, and I could feel the temperature plummeting as the figure drew nearer. I had no choice. I ran. The others followed, but it wasn't enough. The figure was gaining on us, moving faster now, gliding effortlessly through the air. We could hear its footsteps, the faint scrape of its shoes on the floor, drawing closer and closer. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The figure had stopped chasing us. It wasn't following us anymore. Instead, it was standing in the hallway, staring directly at me. "Help me," it whispered again, louder this time, more demanding. My body froze in place, terror gripping me so tight I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to get out of that place and never look back, but something held me there. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Something deep inside told me that I needed to know what was happening, that I needed to understand why this place was haunted, and why that figure was reaching out to us. Before I could even process the thought, the lights in the hallway flickered. One by one, they went out, plunging us into complete darkness. My flashlight buzzed once, then died. The oppressive silence descended like a weight, smothering us. I could barely hear my breathing, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it was all I could focus on. Suddenly, the air shifted. A low, guttural noise rumbled from the depths of the hospital, vibrating the walls. It sounded like something massive, something ancient stirring to life. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I felt a sharp, bone-chilling cold creeping up my legs, like icy fingers tightening their grip on me. Then, as quickly as it had all started, it stopped. There was silence. Complete silence. We stood there, frozen, each of us struggling to breathe, to move, to make sense of what had just happened. I turned around, half expecting the figure to be standing behind me, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. No shadows, no whispers, no figure in the elevator. Charlie led the way, his face a mask of panic. He lost all semblance of control, his movements frantic as he sprinted ahead, turning corners without thinking. He was only a few steps ahead of me, but his frantic pace made it seem like we were miles apart. The others were behind me, just as disoriented and terrified as I was. We didn't speak. There were no words, no explanations, no comfort we could offer each other. We were all consumed by the fear, the reality that we had just come face to face with something far beyond our understanding. I could hear their breaths, ragged and strained, but it felt like everything around us was muffling the sounds. We passed the elevator shaft again, the same one where the figure had been, but the doors were now sealed tight, the darkness inside impenetrable. The quiet that followed the terror was suffocating, like the hospital was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Where's the exit?" Charlie's voice broke through the heavy silence, sounding distant and frantic. I didn't know the answer. I hadn't paid attention to the layout of the hospital, too caught up in the horrors that unfolded. We'd wandered too far from the main entrance, too far into the heart of the building. The lights flickered above us, casting an eerie glow as we rounded another corner. The flickering grew more intense, each light buzzing with a maddening hum that echoed through the halls, amplifying the feeling of being hunted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out, to demand that someone explain what was happening. But I was afraid that if I did, the fear would swallow me whole, and I wouldn't be able to stop it. Then, in the distance, I saw it, the exit. The heavy metal doors that led to freedom, to the outside world, where the night air could finally clear my lungs. I sprinted toward them, my feet pounding against the cracked, broken floor. But just as my hand reached for the door handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I froze. My heart stopped, and for a moment, everything in the world ceased to exist. The door was closed, locked. We were trapped. Charlie grabbed my shoulder, shaking me with urgency. "No, no, no. We can't be stuck here. We need to get out." I tried the handle again, with all my strength, but it was no use. The door remained firmly shut, mocking our every attempt. I felt like I was losing my mind, that I was caught in some sort of twisted nightmare from which I could never wake up. "Calm down," one of the others said. It was Marcus. His voice sounded steady, but I could tell that his heart was racing as fast as mine. "Let's think. We'll figure it out." But how could we figure it out? What was there to figure? Every step we had taken had led us deeper into the grip of the hospital, into whatever had been waiting for us. There were no answers. There was only the ever-present terror, the overwhelming sensation that we were out of our depth, that we had no control, that we were part of something far larger than ourselves. "We can't stay here," Charlie shouted. "We need to find another way out." I nodded, unable to form words. We were surrounded. The hallway stretched on forever, each corner revealing more shadows, more emptiness, more unknowns. But we had to keep moving. We couldn't stay trapped in this place, in whatever it had become. We turned back toward the depths of the hospital, each of us silently hoping that the next turn would lead us to salvation. The silence was almost deafening now, broken only by the occasional creak of the building's crumbling structure. The feeling of being hunted still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the elevator, but there was nothing, only the unsettling, oppressive darkness. We stumbled through the halls for what felt like hours. Our feet dragged with exhaustion, our bodies heavy with fear. Time had lost all meaning. But it wasn't the passage of time that held us captive. It was the realization that we had not left the hospital. The building had become a maze that had no exit, no way out. We were lost in its depths, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. Eventually, we came to a stop in what seemed like an old storage room, cluttered with broken equipment, boxes, and medical supplies that hadn't been touched in years. We collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, too tired to speak. The fear was still there, gnawing at our insides, but now it was tinged with something else, confusion. We had seen the figure. We had heard the whispers. We had felt the building closing in around us. And yet, here we were, still alive, still trapped. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. There was nothing we could do. The hospital had us. We were caught in its grip, and no matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we tried to escape, it would never let us go. It wasn't until hours later, when we had finally gathered enough strength to try the exit doors again, that we realized something. They were open. The hospital had let us go. We stumbled outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath as the weight of everything that had happened settled over us. The sky above was clear, but everything felt wrong, like the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. We had been to the hospital, and we had faced whatever had been waiting for us. But we had escaped. For now. As we left the grounds behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not truly free. Something had followed us. Something had marked us. And I knew deep in my bones that it would never be over. The hospital had let us go, but only because it had finished with us. For now. We didn't speak much as we left. The air was thick with questions, with the unknown. But one thing was clear: we had been part of something that had no explanation, something that could never be fully understood. The days that followed our escape from the hospital felt like a blur. Each one passed in a haze, as if reality itself had been warped. We tried to return to normal, tried to convince ourselves that we had simply imagined everything: the strange noises, the shadows that moved, the oppressive feeling that had weighed us down. But it was hard to ignore the truth, hard to shake the feeling that something had changed in us, something that would never be undone. I couldn't bring myself to visit the hospital again, though I had passed by it a few times on my way home. The place stood there, silent and imposing, like a forgotten monument to a long-forgotten past. The windows were dark, the walls covered in grime and peeling paint. It seemed abandoned, yet somehow it never felt completely empty. Every time I looked at it, I couldn't help but feel that it was waiting for something, waiting for us to come back. But we never did. We tried to move on with our lives. Charlie threw himself back into his work, though I could see the unease in his eyes whenever he was alone. Marcus, usually the calm one, became restless, his nights filled with strange dreams that he refused to talk about. I, on the other hand, couldn't escape the memories. They followed me, clung to me like a shadow that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the fear that haunted me, though. It was the question that had lingered in my mind ever since we left the hospital. What had really happened? We had seen the figure, heard the whispers, felt the presence that had been all around us. But there had been no answers, no explanation for the horrors we'd witnessed. The police had been called after we had fled, but when they arrived at the hospital, there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. just a decaying, abandoned building that seemed perfectly still, perfectly empty. They had found nothing. It was as if the hospital had erased its own tracks, as if it had never been there at all. And yet, I knew what we had experienced. I knew that we had not imagined it. What had happened to us was real, and the truth was that we had been lucky to escape. But the luck wouldn't last forever. I could feel it. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice strange things. Little things, nothing too alarming at first. Shadows that moved out of the corner of my eye, figures I couldn't quite place in my peripheral vision. The sensation of being watched, even when I was alone. It didn't help that I had nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams that felt far too real. In every one of them, I was back in that hospital, trapped in the same maze of halls, trying to escape from something I couldn't understand. And when I woke up, drenched in sweat and heart pounding, I would swear that I could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't long before Charlie began to experience the same things. He would call me late at night, his voice shaking, telling me about the shadows he saw moving in his apartment, the footsteps he heard when no one was there. It was clear to both of us. Whatever we had encountered in that hospital had not stayed behind. It had followed us, and it was getting worse. Marcus was the first to break. He called me one afternoon, his voice barely a whisper on the other end of the phone. He had been doing research, he said. Research into the hospital, into its history, into the strange events that had unfolded there over the years. He had found something that he refused to tell me over the phone. He wanted to meet in person. When we met, Marcus was different. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He had found something, he said, but it wasn't just the hospital's history that had unsettled him. It was the connection between the hospital and us, something he hadn't understood until now. There were records, old documents, news articles buried deep in the archives that spoke of patients who had gone missing, who had been taken by something that the hospital could not explain, something that had always been there, waiting. And according to Marcus, it wasn't just the hospital that had been affected. It was us. We were marked, he said. The presence that had followed us, that had haunted us, was not a mere shadow. It was a force, something that had latched onto us and would never let go. And if we didn't do something, if we didn't find a way to confront it, it would continue to haunt us for the rest of our lives. But there was nothing we could do. The hospital was gone, abandoned, forgotten. We had no way to confront whatever force had followed us. All we had were memories, vague fragments of terror that were now seeping into every part of our lives. So we did nothing, and the haunting continued. As time went on, I stopped trying to make sense of it. I stopped looking for answers, stopped hoping that somehow everything would go back to normal. The hospital had taken its toll on us, and no matter where we went or what we did, we were never truly free. I had learned that much. The world was full of things we couldn't understand, and some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But maybe that was just the way it had to be. Maybe some stories were never meant to have an ending, only an ongoing silence that stretched out forever. So here I am, sharing this with you, the final piece of a puzzle that can never be solved. Whatever it was that haunted that hospital, whatever it is that still follows me now, I don't know. But I do know this. Once you've seen it, once you've felt it, there is no going back. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to forget, it will always find you. It was an ordinary evening, a typical day that didn't seem like it would lead to anything out of the ordinary. But the further I go into this story, the more I realize how wrong I was to ever believe that. This was no ordinary lighthouse, and no ordinary person. It was about 6 months ago when I found myself taking a solo trip down to the coast for some time away from the chaos of everyday life. I needed a break from the noise, the responsibilities, and the constant rush of city life. Just a few days to breathe, to be by the ocean, and recharge. The lighthouse stood alone on the farthest point of the coastline. It was a towering structure, tall enough to see from almost anywhere along the shore. From my hotel, it seemed like a relic of another time old, slightly weathered, but still standing proud against the relentless crash of waves and wind. I'd always been drawn to such places, lonely, isolated, and somewhat mysterious. During my stay, I spent my mornings walking along the beach, the sand cool beneath my feet, the ocean breeze thick with the scent of salt and seaweed. My afternoons were spent reading, catching up on some much-needed relaxation. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I wandered, I always found myself looking at that lighthouse in the distance. It wasn't like I had any particular reason to be fascinated by it, but something about it just called to me. I remember thinking that it'd be a good idea to finally visit the lighthouse. I'd heard stories about it, of course, who hasn't? Lighthouses always seem to come with a bit of mystery, with a sprinkle of history and folklore. But no one had ever said anything bad about it. In fact, most people spoke of it as if it were a local landmark, something you just had to see if you were in the area. I thought it would be a peaceful, scenic walk up to the top, a chance to soak in the views. The day I finally decided to go was bright, sunny, and perfect for a walk. I grabbed my camera to capture a few photos of the surroundings, mostly for memory's sake. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. It was just a lighthouse after all. I parked my car at the base of the hill where the path to the lighthouse began, and started the short, winding climb up the hill. As I approached the lighthouse, I noticed how much quieter the area became. It wasn't the kind of quiet you experience when you're out on a secluded beach or deep in the woods. No, this was a different kind of silence, a stillness, almost as if the air itself was holding its breath. The higher I went, the more oppressive that silence felt. It wasn't unsettling at first, just odd. But then, as I reached the base of the lighthouse, I realized something. There was no sound of the ocean anymore. The waves that had been crashing relentlessly against the rocks below were gone. The lighthouse stood tall before me, casting a long shadow on the ground. The structure itself was massive, its white paint, once bright, now faded and chipped from years of exposure to the elements. The metal door at the base was rusted, but still hanging firmly on its hinges. The air around the lighthouse felt heavy, almost as though the building itself was breathing in time with the wind that whipped around it. I stepped forward, feeling a strange impulse to touch the door, but hesitated. There was something unnerving about the place, something that I couldn't quite place. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel a sense of something watching me. I shrugged it off as paranoia. Maybe it was the isolation, the fact that I was all alone in this quiet place. But I still didn't approach the door. Instead, I lingered for a while, staring at the lighthouse from different angles. My mind wandered to all the stories I'd heard about places like this. Old tales of ghosts, strange happenings, and eerie sightings. It wasn't like I truly believed in them, but something about this place, in that moment, made the stories feel all too real. I stayed for an hour or so, just walking around the perimeter of the lighthouse, snapping pictures and taking in the view. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the pull of the place, the way it seemed to trap you in its presence. The wind had picked up, and I could feel it biting at my skin, but I didn't want to leave just yet. Something was keeping me there. Something I didn't fully understand. But eventually, the feeling of unease began to grow, and I knew it was time to head back. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something strange, a light. It flickered in the top of the lighthouse, where the lantern room should have been. The lighthouse hadn't been in operation for years, and yet there it was, shining as bright as any beacon I'd ever seen. I froze, staring up at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light stayed on for several minutes, casting a cold, eerie glow across the landscape. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it went out. The lighthouse stood there, silent and dark once again. I didn't know what to make of it. My heart raced, and my thoughts started to spiral. But I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself that it was probably just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of the setting sun. I walked back down the hill to my car, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. That night, I couldn't get the lighthouse out of my mind. The flickering light, the strange stillness, and the way the air had felt so heavy, almost as though the lighthouse was watching me. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning of something I would never forget. The days that followed my visit to the lighthouse should have been like any other. I went about my business, enjoyed the coast, walked along the beach at sunset, and let the rhythm of life take me where it would. But in the back of my mind, something had shifted. That strange moment with the flickering light had gnawed at me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I tried to push it away, convincing myself that I had imagined it or that it was just a coincidence. But sometimes coincidences have a way of sticking with you, don't they? I woke up the next morning to a gray sky, thick with clouds, the air heavy with moisture. It was one of those mornings where the world feels damp, like the sun never quite reaches the earth. I had planned to take a long walk along the shore, but something about the weather made me reconsider. Instead, I decided to explore the nearby town, just to stretch my legs and find a bit of distraction. As I walked down the narrow cobbled streets, my thoughts kept drifting back to the lighthouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened there, something that I hadn't fully understood. I remembered the flickering light and how it had seemed so out of place, so disconnected from reality. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't sit right with me. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to my hotel and take a break. I didn't have any particular plans, but I figured I'd give the lighthouse a second thought later, maybe go back and explore some more, take a few more photos, and see if anything seemed off again. As I approached my room, I noticed something strange. My door was slightly ajar, just a crack. I froze for a moment, unsure of what I was seeing. I always locked my door whenever I left, and I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. Yet here it was, wide open, as if someone had been inside. My heart started to race, my mind jumping to conclusions. Had someone broken in? Was there something missing? But as I pushed the door open fully, I found nothing out of place. My bag was where I'd left it, the bed neatly made, the room just as I had left it. Still, that unsettling feeling crept up my spine. Who would open the door like that, and why? I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a gust of wind or an oversight on my part. Maybe I had left it unlocked by accident. I locked the door again and went about my business, trying not to overthink it. But that's when it started. The first thing I noticed was a chill. It was a cold that settled over me, like a draft moving through the room, even though all the windows were closed. At first, I thought it was the weather outside, the damp, cool air that had crept in. But then I realized something wasn't right. The temperature didn't make sense. It wasn't cold enough to warrant this kind of chill. It felt unnatural, almost like the room itself was holding its breath. I stood still for a moment, trying to figure out what was causing it. I walked over to the window and checked to make sure it was sealed properly. Everything was fine, yet the cold lingered. It wasn't biting, not like winter's chill, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. I pulled the blankets around me tighter and went to lie back down, hoping to shake off the creeping unease. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I thought I heard something, an odd sound, faint but distinct. It was almost like footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was pacing just outside my door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, listening intently. But no, there was nothing. No footsteps, No sound at all. I dismissed it as the wind again, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone, after all. There was no one here except for me. I reached for my phone to check the time, hoping that focusing on something mundane would ease my mind. But that's when I saw it. The message. It was a text from an unknown number. Just a single line. No explanation. No greeting. Just words. Don't go back to the lighthouse. My heart skipped a beat as I read the message over and over again, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I didn't recognize the number, and I didn't know anyone who would send me a message like that. But there it was, as clear as day. It wasn't a prank, and it didn't seem like a mistake. It was a warning, one I couldn't ignore. I sat there for a moment, frozen in place. My mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it connected to the strange events I'd experienced at the lighthouse? The flickering light, the silence, the unease that had settled over me. Could this be more than just coincidence? I stood up and walked to the window, trying to clear my head. The world outside was darkening, the clouds thickening. The lighthouse, which I hadn't noticed until now, seemed to loom in the distance. It was hard to see clearly, but I could just make out the outline of the tower, its shadow stretching long across the shore. It stood there, unmoving, but somehow alive with a presence that sent shivers down my spine. A knock on the door suddenly startled me, making me jump. My mind had been so preoccupied with the message and the lighthouse that I hadn't heard anyone approach. I opened the door cautiously, expecting it to be housekeeping or perhaps someone from the hotel staff. Instead, I was met with nothing but emptiness. The hallway was silent, deserted. No one was there. My pulse raised as I stepped into the hall, looking both ways. But there was no one in sight. I went back inside the room, my stomach twisting with unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the message, about the lighthouse, about the strange events that had been unfolding. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And then, just as I thought I might drift off into an uneasy sleep, I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and steady, coming from somewhere outside my door. This time, I didn't wait to investigate. I bolted up from the bed and rushed to the door, throwing it open with a force that left me breathless. But once again, there was nothing. No one was there. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that feels like it's pushing against your ears. I shut the door quickly, my mind racing with possibilities. That's when I heard it. The soft, distant sound of a bell. It was faint, like a muffled chime, but it was unmistakable. The sound of a lighthouse bell. I stood there, frozen, realizing that I had never heard that bell before. Not from the distance, not from the hotel. It was as if it was calling me, beckoning me back to the place that had been unsettling me since the moment I arrived. I knew then that something wasn't just strange about the lighthouse, it was something I couldn't escape. The next few days felt like a constant, growing storm on the horizon, an ever-present sense of dread that gnawed at the back of my mind. I tried to go about my usual routine, walking along the beach, visiting the local shops, but the feeling never left. I kept remembering the strange flickering light I had seen from my room, and the message that had appeared on my phone, "Don't go back to the lighthouse." But I couldn't understand why. Why would someone I didn't even know send me a warning like that? I had to know what was going on. So, against my better judgment, I decided I needed to return to the lighthouse. I needed answers. That morning, I woke up early, my nerves already frayed by the unease that had been building. The air was thick with fog, the kind that made everything look muted and distant. I felt like I was walking through a dream, the world soft around the edges, as if the fog had swallowed up all the sound. Even the waves crashing against the shore sounded muffled, like they were coming from far away. I grabbed my coat and left the hotel without a word to anyone. My footsteps echoed on the cobbled streets, but it felt like no one was around to hear them. The fog seemed to swallow the town whole, leaving me feeling isolated and small. I walked towards the cliffside where the lighthouse stood, my eyes locked on the looming structure in the distance. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become. It wasn't just the fog. There was a weight to it, as though the very atmosphere was dense with some invisible force. My heart began to pound, and the closer I got to the lighthouse, the more I could hear that faint bell ringing again. It wasn't a real bell, not one I could touch or see, but it was there inside my mind, like a haunting melody that seemed to grow louder with every step I took. I reached the base of the lighthouse just as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the fog. The building was taller than I had remembered, looming over me like a giant. Its paint was chipped and faded, the stones of the tower weathered and worn. The windows were small and dark, and there was an almost unnatural stillness to it. But it wasn't the building itself that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the feeling, the sensation that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at the lighthouse, my breath visible in the cold air. Then, without warning, a door creaked open. I had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, but I had not seen anyone approach. My pulse quickened as a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a face weathered by time. His clothes were old, and his eyes, dark and hollow, looked as though they had seen things I couldn't even imagine. He didn't say a word as he stepped out of the lighthouse, his gaze fixed on me with a strange intensity. My instincts told me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from this man who seemed to exist outside of time itself. "Are you looking for something?" he asked, his voice rough, like gravel scraping against stone. I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. I'm just here to see the lighthouse," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. The man didn't move, didn't blink. His expression remained unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly, as if it were a warning rather than a statement. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the lighthouse, disappearing behind the heavy door. I stood there, stunned and confused. What was that about? Who was he, and why did he say I shouldn't be here? But before I could gather my thoughts, the door to the lighthouse slammed shut, and the world seemed to shift. The fog that had surrounded the lighthouse began to swirl, moving in strange patterns, almost like it had a mind of its own. The air grew thick and stifling, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I hesitated for a moment, but then a strange compulsion took hold of me. I had to know what was going on. So, with my heart hammering in my chest, I approached the lighthouse. The door was still closed, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a crack in the stonework that hadn't been there before. It was small, barely noticeable, but there it was, a faint line running vertically up the side of the tower. It was as if something had been disturbed, something had changed. Without thinking, I pushed against the stone, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of something old. The faintest light filtered through the cracks in the stone, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The interior of the lighthouse was exactly how I had imagined it: old, abandoned, and covered in layers of grime. But as I stepped further inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I paused, straining to listen. There was no sound, no movement, no voices, but the air felt charged, like static before a storm. I moved cautiously through the narrow corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with old books and nautical charts, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. At the end of the hallway, I found a narrow staircase that led up to the top of the lighthouse. Without thinking, I climbed the stairs, my breath coming faster with each step. When I reached the top, I stepped into the lantern room, the place where the light had once shone out across the sea. But there was no light now, just emptiness. The large glass panes were cracked, and the machinery that powered the light was long gone. But in the center of the room, something caught my eye. It was a large, dusty book, open on the floor as though it had been left there in a hurry. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to the point where most of the text was illegible. But as I bent down to pick it up, a chill swept through the room, and I could have sworn I heard the faintest whisper, low and indistinct, like a voice trying to speak through thick glass. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them in my bones like they were meant for me. I hurriedly closed the book, my hands trembling as I placed it back where I had found it. The air had grown heavier, and the sense of unease had returned tenfold. Something wasn't right. I wasn't supposed to be here. And just as I turned to leave, I heard the bell again. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, clear, and ringing in my ears. The bell from the lighthouse was calling me, and I had no choice but to answer. The air was thick with an overwhelming tension that seemed to vibrate in every corner of the lighthouse. I stood frozen in the lantern room, the deafening sound of the bells still ringing in my ears. Each toll felt like a punch to the chest, a reminder that I was no longer in control. My pulse was racing, and my hands, clammy and cold, gripped the edges of the stone walls for support. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the bell wouldn't stop. It rang with an intensity that made my head ache, reverberating through the very bones of the lighthouse. My heart was pounding now, my breath shallow as I turned toward the exit, my feet unsteady beneath me. I wanted to run, to flee from the lighthouse that had become a prison in the span of only a few hours. But something I couldn't quite explain kept me rooted to the spot. A low voice whispered through the room, the sound of it like the breath of someone standing right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the book I had placed back on the floor moments earlier. But the presence, the feeling of something watching me, guiding me, was undeniable. And then I saw it. The shadow. It moved across the walls of the lantern room, a dark silhouette that seemed to shift and twist, as if it were made of the very darkness itself. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. The shadow had substance, it had purpose, and it was coming closer. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, thickening the air until it became suffocating. The bell rang again, louder this time, as if it were coming from within the very walls themselves. I turned, my body trembling with fear, and there, standing in the doorway, was the man I had seen earlier, the gaunt figure from before, his hollow eyes locked on me with an unsettling intensity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze was enough to freeze me in place. But there was something in his expression, something that had shifted. His face, once cold and unreadable, was now contorted in a way that filled me with dread. It was as though he had become a part of the very nightmare that the lighthouse had become. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air was thick with terror, and my throat felt as though it were closing up, as though the very space around me was pushing against my chest. "What's happening?" I finally managed to choke out. "What is all of this? Why did you warn me?" The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. The darkness seemed to pulse with each movement he made, as though it were alive, feeding off the fear that was radiating from my every pore. "It's too late," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "You've already seen too much." Suddenly, the shadow in the corner of the room shifted again, this time growing larger, stretching out toward me with an unnatural speed. My heart raced in my chest as the air around me seemed to bend and twist. The shadow reached toward me with long, twisting tendrils, and I felt an icy chill run through my body, as if my very soul were being pulled into the darkness. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped in the lighthouse with this thing. The man no longer just a man smiled, and for the first time, I saw it, the truth behind his hollow eyes. He wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood. He was a part of the lighthouse, a manifestation of everything it had absorbed over the years. The whispers, the ringing bell, the strange occurrences, they had all been leading up to this moment. I had become part of the lighthouse's history, just as he had. "You're too far in now," he said, his smile widening, his teeth sharp and unnaturally white against the darkness. "You've crossed over." I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with panic. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I realized that the door, the one I had come through just moments ago, was no longer there. The room had changed. The walls were closing in, the floor beneath me shifting, as if the lighthouse itself were alive, rearranging its very structure to trap me inside. The man's voice echoed around me, the sound distorting, becoming a cacophony of whispers. I couldn't focus on anything his words, the shadows, the ringing bell. It all collided in a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of my sanity. "Join us," the man said again, his voice reverberating through the room. "Become a part of the lighthouse. You're already here, and you will never leave." The darkness that had consumed me, surrounding every inch of the room, slowly began to lift, as if it had never been there in the first place. My eyes fluttered open, but I wasn't sure I could trust what I saw. The lantern room, the shadows, the man, everything felt like a half-forgotten dream, an illusion that my mind had conjured in its panic. I sat up, my head spinning, every muscle in my body aching from the unnatural tension that had gripped me just moments ago. Had it been real? Had any of it been real? I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the dizziness that still clouded my thoughts. The room seemed unchanged, as though it were untouched by whatever strange events had transpired. The bell, the whispering shadow, the figure that had stalked me gone. There was nothing but the dim glow of the lantern, flickering faintly in the distance. I slowly rose to my feet, my legs weak, as though they had been hollowed out. Each step felt heavier than the last, my every movement a reminder of how close I had come to losing myself to the nightmare of the lighthouse. I had to leave. The weight of what I'd experienced felt too heavy, too all-consuming for me to stay another second. But there was nothing. I opened the door, and the cool night air hit me like a rush of freedom. I stepped out onto the balcony, my feet finally meeting solid ground, and breathed deeply, pulling in the crisp ocean air. The sky was dark, the stars scattered across the heavens like distant diamonds, untouched by the chaos I had just endured. The storm had passed, the wind now gentle, as if nothing had happened at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something had shifted. I turned back toward the lighthouse, the towering structure now looming behind me, its silhouette dark against the starry sky. I should have felt relieved, should have been thankful to be free, but there was something about the lighthouse that still held me in its grip. My eyes lingered on the flickering lantern light at the top, a faint glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as if it was calling to me, beckoning me to return. But I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. I had learned my lesson. Whatever dark force haunted that lighthouse, whatever presence had been waiting for someone like me, it was not something I could fight or escape. It had been waiting, watching, for years, maybe even centuries, and I had been foolish enough to walk into its grasp. There was no resolving it. There was no understanding it. The lighthouse was more than just a building. It was a gateway, a prison, and whatever was inside it had been waiting for someone to become part of its endless cycle. I walked away from the lighthouse, my footsteps quickening as I neared the safety of my car. I had to leave. I had to get as far away from this place as possible. The road ahead was long, but with each mile that stretched out before me, I felt a small sense of relief. The lighthouse was behind me, out of sight. But the memory of it, the feeling of being trapped, of being consumed by the darkness remained. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't forget it. As I drove further into the night, the road stretching out before me, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that the nightmare was over, but I couldn't. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many turns I made, the memories haunted me. The whispering shadows, the tolling bell, the man with hollow eyes, those images would stay with me forever. I had escaped the lighthouse, but the question lingered in my mind. Had I really escaped? Or had I simply become another part of its story, just as the man had warned me? I didn't know. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of it all, the uncertainty, the unanswered questions that would forever gnaw at my mind. I pulled into a gas station sometime later, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I needed a break, a moment to regain my composure. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me again, but something felt off. I couldn't place it, but there was an unease in the air, like something was wrong. As I turned toward the station, my eyes fell on the weathered sign in the distance. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was enough. The words, etched into the metal, were unmistakable. Lighthouse. I froze. My heart dropped to my stomach. No, it couldn't be. I had left. I had left that place behind. But there it was again, another lighthouse, another sign. I looked around, panic creeping in, but there was nothing else. Just the gas station and the empty road. I glanced back at the sign, only to see it flicker once more, as if waiting for me to take notice. I turned away quickly, not daring to look back again. I had no answers. The questions I had about the man, the shadow, the bell remained. The lighthouse, though seemingly behind me, felt like it was always there, lurking, waiting. I got back into my car, locking the doors and gripping the wheel with a strength I didn't know I had left. I wasn't sure what had happened or why I had been drawn to that place, but one thing was certain. Some things, some places are better left alone. The miles stretched on in silence as I continued my journey, the hum of the engine filling the space, the only sound to accompany my racing thoughts. I drove through the night, no particular destination in mind, no clear plan of action. I had left the lighthouse behind, or at least I thought I had. But now the question loomed large. Had I really escaped? Or had I simply wandered into a new chapter of the same old story? I couldn't escape the haunting feeling that had been with me since that night, since the moment I first stepped foot inside that lighthouse. The man with the hollow eyes, the tolling bell, the oppressive weight of the shadows that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. It wasn't just a place, it was a feeling that clung to me no matter how far I drove or how hard I tried to ignore it. The road seemed endless, a blur of headlights and darkness, the landscape around me swallowed by the night. I kept my focus on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I couldn't allow myself to slip into the past, to let those memories consume me again. I had to stay alert. I had to keep moving. But despite my best efforts, the thought kept creeping in. What if it wasn't over? What if the lighthouse hadn't let go of me, and no matter how far I ran, it would always find a way to pull me back in? I slowed down, the car coming to a stop at a small diner by the side of the road. Its flickering neon sign buzzed faintly in the night, casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. I needed a break, some time to clear my head, to put some distance between me and the darkness that had followed me since that night. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cool night air rush over me, grounding me in the present. The scent of rain lingered in the air, a reminder of the storm that had passed hours ago. The diner was empty, save for an older woman behind the counter. She looked up as I entered, offering a small smile before going back to wiping down the counter. Her presence was a stark contrast to the weight I had been carrying. For a moment, I felt almost normal again, as if the world hadn't been turned upside down by the lighthouse. I took a seat at the counter, ordering a cup of coffee. The warm liquid provided a brief moment of comfort, though the unease in my stomach refused to fade. I glanced around the room, noticing the worn booths, the flickering fluorescent lights, the faded menu hanging above the counter. It was just another roadside diner, ordinary, unremarkable. But as I sipped the coffee, I couldn't help but feel the gnawing sense that something was off. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness, but everything appeared normal. The road stretched out before me, quiet and still. Yet the feeling in the pit of my stomach remained, as though something was waiting just beyond my line of sight. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I had to stop letting my mind wander back to the lighthouse. I had to stop letting it haunt me. As I finished my coffee and prepared to leave, I noticed a small newspaper clipping taped to the wall behind the counter. It was yellowed with age, the edges curled from time. I leaned in, squinting to make out the faded text. It was a small article, tucked in the corner of the page, but the words caught my attention. Local lighthouse closed after tragic incident. I froze, my hand pausing mid-motion. The article was from years ago, but the photo accompanying it struck me immediately. It was a picture of the lighthouse, the very same lighthouse I had visited. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The caption beneath the photo read, "The lighthouse has been abandoned since the mysterious disappearance of the keeper. Authorities say no one has lived in the lighthouse for over 2 decades, but rumors persist that the building remains haunted." I stared at the article, my mind racing. The keeper, was that the man I had seen? Was he the one who had warned me, who had tried to stop me from making the same mistake he had? The image of his hollow eyes flashed in my mind, and for the first time since I had left, I felt a real sense of terror creeping up on me. The woman behind the counter must have noticed my reaction, because she stepped over to where I was sitting, her eyes scanning the article before she spoke, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You've heard about the lighthouse, haven't you?" she asked, her gaze lingering on the newspaper. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. How could I explain to her what I had felt, what I had seen, the things I could never fully describe? "The keeper," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "They say he never left, that he's still there, still waiting for someone to come back. He never made it out, you know. They say his spirit's still trapped in the lighthouse, looking for someone to take his place." I swallowed hard, the words chilling me to my core. Was she talking about the same man I had encountered? Was he still there, waiting for me, just like he had been waiting for the keeper all those years ago? I paid for my coffee in silence, my mind spinning. As I left the diner and stepped back into the car, I could feel the weight of the encounter settling in on me. I had thought I had left the lighthouse behind. I had convinced myself that I had escaped its grip. But now, I wasn't so sure. I drove away from the diner, the roads once again stretching out before me, but the peace I had briefly felt was gone. The questions that had been haunting me since that night were louder now, demanding answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The lighthouse wasn't just a place, it was a part of something much larger, something older, something I couldn't fully comprehend. It was a warm autumn afternoon when I set off on my hike into the woods. Just a regular, quiet day, nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. The forest had always been a place I found peace. I'd spent so many days walking those trails, knowing every twist and turn like the back of my hand. I've always been an outdoor person, someone who finds comfort in the hum of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, but in a good way, reminding you that the world was much bigger than yourself. My plan was simple: take a short walk through the woods, clear my head, and get some fresh air. It wasn't the first time I'd been to this particular patch of forest. It was just a few miles from my house, a place that had always felt like home. There was something about the towering trees, the moss-covered stones, and the soft dirt beneath my feet that made me feel connected to the earth in a way that nothing else did. I wasn't alone either. I had a few close friends, all outdoor enthusiasts, who were familiar with this place. We had shared many walks here, chatting and laughing, all with the background of the forest surrounding us. It was, in a way, the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. That day, though, I was alone. I didn't mind it much, as sometimes solitude was exactly what I needed. The forest had a calming effect on me, its silence and serenity offering a reprieve from the noise of the world. I had my backpack with me, packed with the essentials, a water bottle, a snack, my phone, and a map, though I rarely needed it. It wasn't a very challenging hike. The paths were well worn and easy to navigate. But there was something different about that day. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The forest felt off, not in any obvious way, but there was a subtle difference, like the air was heavier and the silence was deeper. The first few miles were uneventful. I could hear the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves, the occasional scurrying of a squirrel, and the wind gently rustling the branches overhead. The sun was starting to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia. It was like stepping into a memory, a place I had known for so long but had somehow started to feel unfamiliar. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort, now seemed distant, as if it were quietly watching me. At one point, I decided to veer off the main path. It was something I had done before, exploring new routes and finding hidden spots that weren't marked on the map. I had been down this particular trail a few times, but I had never gone deeper into the woods beyond a certain point. Today, however, something urged me to keep going. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an instinct pulling me forward. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The light grew dimmer, the trees more densely packed. The air grew colder too, despite the fact that the temperature outside was still warm. As I continued down the narrow, winding path, the familiar sounds of the forest began to fade. The usual bird song, the rustling of animals in the underbrush, all of it disappeared. It was as if the forest had become quieter. The only sound left was the faint creaking of trees swaying in the wind, but even that felt distant, muffled. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I had been in the woods countless times before, and nothing strange had ever happened. But today was different. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was something about this place that didn't sit right with me. The trees seemed to close in around me, their thick trunks and branches creating a canopy that blocked out the last of the daylight. I checked my phone, and as expected, there was no signal. It didn't matter. I wasn't planning on being out here for too long. But as I walked further, I started to feel lost. This path didn't look familiar, and the trees were beginning to look almost identical. Every time I looked around, everything seemed to blend together. The trail, which had been so clearly marked at the start, had slowly disappeared under a thick layer of fallen leaves and underbrush. I had always prided myself on knowing these woods, but now I was starting to doubt myself. I paused for a moment, trying to get my bearings. I looked around, but nothing seemed familiar. The forest felt vast and unfamiliar, and the comforting sense of knowing where I was began to slip away. It was then that I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the rush of my own heartbeat. It was the sound of something moving through the underbrush, but it wasn't the usual scurrying of small animals. This was different. This was deliberate. A slow, steady movement, like something, or someone, was following me. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around quickly, scanning the trees behind me. But there was nothing, only the darkened forest stretching endlessly into the distance. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but a knot had formed in my stomach. I knew something was wrong. The air felt thicker now, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I shook my head, trying to clear the unsettling thought. I had to get back on track. But the path had disappeared completely. It was at that moment that I realized just how alone I truly was. There was no one around for miles, and the vast expanse of trees seemed to stretch on forever, offering no way out. I had always felt in control in the woods, but now, as I stood in that unfamiliar place, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was conspiring against me. It wasn't just a hike anymore. It was something much darker. Something was wrong, and I couldn't quite grasp what it was. As I stood there in the middle of the forest, trying to piece together the situation, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. The familiar sounds of the forest had completely vanished. Not a bird, not a rustle, nothing. There was a strange, eerie silence that seemed to weigh on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had been walking these woods for years, but I had never felt this sense of unease. It was as if the forest itself had gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced around, trying to regain my bearings, but everything looked the same. The thick trees and their twisted roots seemed to stretch out endlessly, each one as indistinguishable as the last. I took a deep breath and looked down at the ground, hoping the path would reveal itself. The underbrush had become thick with tangled vines and thorns, making it nearly impossible to discern any sort of trail. That's when I noticed something unusual. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stared at the ground, I couldn't deny it. There, among the fallen leaves, was a distinct footprint. I knelt down, examining it closely. The print was large, too large to belong to any animal I knew of. It had a deep, heavy impression, as if something or someone had stepped with great force. The edges of the print were jagged, uneven, and the soil around it was disturbed in a way that didn't seem natural. My heart began to race as I stood up and glanced around again. The trees seemed to loom over me, their shadows growing longer as the last of the daylight disappeared. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow as I tried to process what I was seeing. I took a few steps back, scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The silence was suffocating, and the air had grown noticeably colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, even though I knew the temperature hadn't dropped enough for it to feel this chilly. The forest seemed to be closing in, and my instinct was telling me to leave. But the print was still there, burned into my mind, a reminder that something was off. I knew that I couldn't stay there, not with that footprint staring me down. But as I turned to retrace my steps, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The path that I had followed was gone. The trees and bushes had shifted, the undergrowth had thickened, and the way I had come no longer seemed to exist. In its place was a solid wall of trees, as if the forest had somehow changed while I wasn't looking. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. The familiar woods that I had known for years now felt foreign, hostile even. I knew I couldn't stand there for long, paralyzed by fear, but I couldn't help myself. I was caught in a state of disbelief. How could the forest change so quickly? How could the path simply vanish? I began to walk in the opposite direction, hoping to find any sign of the path I had been on. The dense trees and underbrush made it difficult to move quickly, and every step felt heavier than the last. With each movement, I felt more trapped, as if the forest were slowly closing in on me, holding me in its grip. It was then that I heard it again. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The crack of a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. It came again, closer this time. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The forest had fallen into such an unnatural silence that even the smallest sound stood out. I stood still for a moment, hoping the sound would fade, that it was just an animal, but the noise continued. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or scurrying of small creatures. This was deliberate, purposeful, like something was moving toward me. My heart was racing now, and the weight of the silence around me was almost suffocating. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks thick and imposing. I could feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down, and I instinctively backed away from the noise, my eyes darting in every direction. I needed to get out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was in those woods with me, something I couldn't see but could feel, just beyond the veil of the trees. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Every step I took felt like I was walking in the dark, even though it was still light enough to see. I picked up the pace, my feet crunching through the fallen leaves. But no matter how fast I walked, the sound seemed to get closer. Then I heard it clearly. A voice! It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A low murmur, almost like a whisper, but not quite. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound itself sent a chill down my spine. My body froze, my breath shallow as I tried to pinpoint where the voice was coming from. But there was no one in sight. The forest around me was still, unnervingly still, except for that faint murmur, growing louder. I looked around desperately, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from any one direction. It was as if it was all around me, swirling through the trees, carried by the wind. The silence had been replaced with this strange, unsettling noise, and I couldn't escape it. My eyes darted to the trees, the underbrush, anywhere I thought the voice might be coming from. But there was nothing. The sound faded just as quickly as it had appeared. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched remained, hanging over me like a cloud. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very trees themselves were observing my every move. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. The unease I felt was overwhelming. I turned again, desperate to find the trail, but it was no use. The forest had swallowed it whole. There was no familiar landmark, no recognizable path. The woods had become a maze, and I was lost within it. My pulse quickened, panic starting to set in. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how I could have missed the trail, how everything had changed so suddenly. But there was no explanation. No rational reason why the woods had shifted, why the path had disappeared, why the voice had whispered from the shadows. As I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. I could feel it in my bones. The oppressive silence that had once settled over me seemed to be growing thicker with each step. The air around me felt heavier, and with every gust of wind, the trees creaked as though groaning under a weight I couldn't see. The shadows of the forest stretched longer, casting eerie shapes on the ground. My senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness. I tried to focus on finding the path again, but the forest had turned into a labyrinth. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me, waiting just behind the trees. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow, heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the more unsettled I became. I began to second-guess my every move, wondering if I was turning in circles, retracing my steps without realizing it. I had to stop. The fear was creeping in too fast, and I needed to regain some semblance of control. I leaned against a tree, trying to calm myself down, but the air was too thick with unease. The weight of the woods around me felt suffocating, and the light was starting to fade. I glanced at my watch. It hadn't been this late when I entered the forest, had it? Time had slipped away unnoticed. I felt as though the forest was stretching time, manipulating it, warping my perception. That's when I heard it again. A twig snapping, but this time it wasn't far. It was close, too close. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound wasn't subtle this time. It was deliberate, a heavy, echoing crack that sounded like it came from just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as I slowly turned my head toward the noise. There was nothing there. The trees stood still, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, but nothing moved. I squinted, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. But nothing did. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It felt too quiet, unnaturally quiet. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. My eyes darted around the trees, searching for anything that might give me a clue as to what was happening. But the more I looked, the more I felt as if the forest was closing in around me. I began to walk again, but at a slower pace, more cautious this time. The path remained elusive, and the deeper I ventured, the more the world around me seemed to shift. I wasn't just lost in the woods, I was lost in a place that didn't quite belong to the world I knew. The trees had begun to feel alive, as if they were watching me, observing my every move. The shadows between the trunks grew deeper, thicker, and I had to fight the urge to look over my shoulder constantly. I had just passed a cluster of thick bushes when I heard it, a soft rustling behind me, as though something was moving through the undergrowth. My blood ran cold again. I turned, but once more, there was nothing. I began to question my own senses. Was I imagining things? Had I just become so paranoid that I was hearing things that weren't there? Or was something truly out there? But there was no time to dwell on that. I needed to keep moving. I pressed on, forcing my legs to carry me further into the heart of the woods. The sun had completely set now, and the darkness had taken hold, wrapping its cold fingers around me. I fumbled for my flashlight, relieved when the beam of light cut through the thick blackness. It didn't bring me comfort, though. It only revealed how much darker and more intimidating the forest looked in the absence of the sun. The trees towered over me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, shifting, as if it were alive. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into something I couldn't control. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow in the distance, something barely visible at the edge of the beam. But as I approached, I could make out the shape more clearly. A figure, tall and unnaturally still. My heart began to race as I drew closer, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, a dark energy that made my skin crawl. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift, morphing from one shape to another, its form elusive, like smoke in the wind. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, or if something else was at work here, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. And that's when I noticed the eyes. Or rather, the lack of them. The face, or what should have been a face, was empty. Just an empty void, a dark abyss that seemed to stare right through me, sucking in the light from the flashlight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and for a brief moment, I felt completely paralyzed, unable to move or look away from the hollow, gaping face. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with fear. I had to get out of there. There was no way I was going to continue deeper into the woods after that. I stumbled back, but my legs felt weak, like they weren't my own anymore. The forest had become a maze, and I couldn't find my way out. Every direction looked the same. The trees loomed larger, the shadows darker, and that feeling of being watched intensified. I had to stop and take a moment to gather myself. I leaned against a tree, my flashlight flickering in my hand. My head was spinning. What had I just seen? Was it real? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made any sense. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be lost like this, and I wasn't supposed to encounter whatever that was. But as I stood there, trying to steady myself, the silence returned, thicker than ever. It felt as though the entire forest had fallen into a suffocating stillness, like it was holding its breath. My body tensed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced around again, scanning the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that might move. But there was nothing. And then the whispering started again. It was soft at first, like the wind stirring through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct, as though the trees themselves were speaking to me. The words were impossible to make out. but the tone was unmistakable, low, guttural, like something ancient and malicious was calling out from the depths of the woods. The sound reverberated through my bones, a sensation that chilled me to my core. I had to get out. There was no other option now. I had to leave before whatever this was swallowed me whole. But as I turned to make my way back, the trees shifted again, and the path I thought I had seen was gone, replaced by thick, twisting branches. The forest had changed once more, its shifting shape tightening its grip on me. There was no way out. The air around me had become unbearably thick, pressing down on my chest with each breath I took. My heart was pounding in my ears, louder than the rustling of the leaves or the low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I was no longer aware of time of how long I had been in this cursed forest. It felt as if the very fabric of reality had twisted into something unrecognizable, and the line between the living world and something else entirely had blurred. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting a jittery beam that barely pierced the suffocating darkness. The trees around me stretched their skeletal limbs high above, blocking out what little light was left from the moon. The forest had become a vast, labyrinthine prison, and I was its prisoner. Each step forward felt like I was walking deeper into the jaws of something ancient and unfathomable. I could hear the whispering again. This time, it wasn't just the faint rustling of the wind or the distant murmur of the forest. The voices were distinct, and they were coming from all around me. Low, raspy, incomprehensible words that seemed to twist and fold into each other. They carried an unnatural weight, vibrating the very air I breathed. The language was foreign, yet there was something terribly familiar about it, like a long-forgotten memory trying to claw its way out of my mind. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, every instinct telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It felt as though the forest itself was closing in, trapping me in its suffocating grip. I tried to turn around, but the path I had just walked was gone, swallowed by the trees. I was lost in a place that defied logic, and the terror that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but none came. How had I gotten here? Why had the forest changed so drastically? What were these voices that seemed to come from the very trees themselves? I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. I ran. My legs finally moved, carrying me forward in a desperate bid for escape. The flashlight beam darted wildly in front of me, casting erratic shadows that danced in the periphery of my vision. My feet scraped against the uneven ground, tripping over rocks and roots as I pushed myself harder. But the forest seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me. No matter how fast I moved, the darkness swallowed me up, and the trees closed in around me, blocking any possible escape. It was as if the very woods themselves were alive, manipulating my every movement, bending the world to their will. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a blur in the distance, a shifting shadow, something out of place in the dark expanse of the forest. I squinted through the darkness, my pulse racing as I tried to make sense of the figure that loomed ahead. As I drew closer, the shape became clearer. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a person. But it wasn't a person like any I had seen before. The figure was tall, unnaturally so. Its limbs were twisted and elongated, its body unnervingly thin. Its face was featureless, save for a pair of hollow eyes that gleamed with a sickly pale light, as though they had been drained of life. There was no mouth, no nose, just smooth, pale skin stretched over an unsettling blank canvas. The creature stood motionless, staring directly at me with those unblinking eyes. I froze. The air around me thickened, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stop. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt as if I were trapped in some kind of nightmare, my body paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the forest was alive with 1,000 voices, all calling to me, urging me forward, urging me to meet the thing that stood before me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to respond. My legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. The creature's gaze burned into me, and for a brief moment, I thought I could feel its presence in my mind. It was as if it was probing my thoughts, tearing through my memories, searching for something deep within me. I could feel its cold, clammy touch on my very soul, pulling at the edges of my consciousness. The darkness around me seemed to deepen, suffocating, as though the forest itself was trying to consume me. And then, the creature moved. It wasn't a fluid motion, but rather a jerky, disjointed shift, like a puppet with its strings cut. It took a step forward, and with that single movement, the world around me shattered. The forest seemed to implode, the trees bending and groaning, as though they were protest against the very presence of this thing. The whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of chaotic voices, all overlapping, all demanding something from me. My head spun, and I felt the edges of my sanity begin to fray. But then, the creature spoke. Its voice was low, guttural, a rasp that felt like gravel being ground against bone. The words were unintelligible at first, a jumble of sounds that twisted in my ears. But then, in a sudden, horrifying clarity, the words began to form. "You should not have come here." The voice was not just a sound, it was a presence, an overwhelming force that reverberated through my body, shaking me to my core. The words were not meant for me. They were meant for something else, something ancient, something far beyond my understanding. But I could feel them, deep within me, as though they had always been there, waiting for this moment. I stumbled backward, my body shaking with fear, my mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what I was facing. But no matter how far I stepped back, I could feel the creature's gaze on me, feel it pulling at the very fabric of my being. It was too much. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged, and I felt as though I was suffocating under the weight of its presence. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. The forest had consumed me, and now I was a part of it. The creature took another step forward, and the ground beneath me trembled, as if the earth itself were shifting, twisting, and bending to its will. The air around me became stifling, the darkness closing in. The creature's hollow eyes locked onto mine once more, and I felt the weight of its gaze pierce through me, stripping away everything I thought I knew. I was lost in this place, lost in a forest that had no beginning and no end, where time was meaningless, and the rules of reality no longer applied. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the creature reached out, its fingers long and cold, I realized the truth. The fingers, pale and long, finally brushed against my skin. A shock of cold ran through my body, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. My mind reeled, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The whispers grew louder, a deafening chorus of voices that twisted through my thoughts, clawing at my sanity. I could hear them clearly now, each voice distinct, each one an echo of something ancient and malevolent. "Leave." The voice of the creature rasped again, its words carrying a weight that pressed down on me like a physical force. And then, without warning, the creature withdrew. Its cold fingers retreated, and the air around me shifted. The heavy, oppressive weight that had been pressing on me lifted, if only for a moment. I staggered backward, disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. I was gasping for breath, trying to steady myself, but the forest refused to release its hold. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches reaching for me like the fingers of a giant hand. The whispers continued, now in a more urgent tone, but I could no longer understand the words. They were no longer a warning, they were a command. I turned and ran. My legs were shaky, my body weak, but I pushed myself forward, desperate to escape. My flashlight flickered again, casting weak beams of light through the darkness as I stumbled through the underbrush. The path ahead was a blur, and every step I took felt like I was walking through a dream, the trees around me stretching unnaturally, distorting the world. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything I had experienced. I could feel the creature's eyes on me, even though it had vanished into the shadows. As I ran, I tried to retrace my steps, but it was impossible. The forest had shifted, as though it were deliberately rearranging itself to keep me trapped. There were no clear paths, no landmarks. Everything looked the same, endless, dark trees that seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear the rustling of the leaves behind me, the sound of something following, but when I dared to look, there was nothing there. I didn't stop. I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat pouring down my face, my body aching from the strain, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. The deeper I went, the more surreal it became. The trees seemed to loom taller, their shadows longer, until I wasn't sure if I was running toward escape or toward some final confrontation with the unknown. It wasn't until I broke through the tree line that I saw the light, the first sign of civilization I had seen in what felt like an eternity. The clearing before me stretched into a road, and in the distance I could make out the headlights of a car. The realization hit me all at once. I had somehow found my way back to the world I had known, to a place where the forest couldn't reach me. I had escaped. But did I really? I stopped at the edge of the road, panting, my eyes wide as I searched the forest behind me. The trees loomed at the edge of the clearing, their branches bending unnaturally, swaying in the wind that shouldn't have been there. The whispers were faint now, but they still echoed in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I didn't dare look back for too long. The car's headlights grew brighter as it approached, and I stepped forward, waving my arms frantically. It was a small, beat-up sedan, the driver slow to react. When the car finally came to a halt in front of me, I was practically gasping for breath. The driver rolled down the window, a man in his late 30s, his face weathered from years of hard work. His eyes widened when he saw me, wild-eyed and disheveled, my clothes torn and covered in dirt. "Hey, what the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. I didn't answer right away. I was too shaken, too terrified to speak. I had no idea what to say, how to explain the nightmare I had just endured. The words caught in my throat, and all I could do was stare at him, desperate for reassurance that I was finally free, that I was safe. "Hey, you're all right now. I'll take you to town," the man said, his voice softening as he leaned over and unlocked the door. "Get in. You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't hesitate. I scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me as if the forest were still right on my heels, ready to drag me back into its darkness. As the car sped away, I glanced out the window, watching the trees recede into the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, calling to me from the depths of the forest. I wanted to believe it was over, that I had escaped, but deep down, I knew the forest hadn't let me go. Not completely. The man didn't speak again as we drove, and I didn't have the strength to ask him any questions. My mind was still reeling from everything I had seen and experienced, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of what had happened. Was it real? Had I really encountered something so unnatural, so twisted? Or had it all been a product of my own mind, a nightmare brought to life by fear and exhaustion? As we approached the town, the car slowed, and I could see the lights of the small houses flickering in the distance. For the first time since I entered that cursed forest, I felt a flicker of relief. I had made it. I was out. The car pulled into a gas station, and the man stopped the engine. "Here you go," he said, his voice gruff. "You need to call someone?" I shook my head, though I wasn't sure what I would say if I did. I couldn't explain this. Not to him, not to anyone. I thanked him quickly and stepped out of the car, my legs still unsteady beneath me. As I walked away, the soft hum of the gas station's lights surrounded me, but even then, the whispers lingered. I could hear them in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. The forest hadn't let go of me yet. And as I glanced over my shoulder one last time, I could have sworn I saw something move in the trees, just beyond the reach of the station lights. But it was gone before I could be sure. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know if I'll ever understand, but I do know one thing. I will never, ever go back. The days that followed my escape from the forest felt like a blur. My body ached with exhaustion, the trauma of that night hanging over me like a cloud I couldn't shake off. I returned to my life, trying to go through the motions, to act as if everything was normal. But nothing felt the same. The forest, the creature, the whispers that all lingered in my mind, a constant reminder that some things are better left unexplored. I tried to tell myself that it was just a nightmare. Maybe the stress of the hike, the isolation, had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen it. I had felt it, the unnatural coldness of the creature's touch, the weight of the forest's oppressive presence. I couldn't ignore the truth, no matter how much I wanted to. I stayed away from the woods after that. I avoided the trails I once walked with ease, never daring to venture near the edge of the forest again. Every time I saw trees stretching toward the sky, my stomach would tighten and my heart would race. I couldn't look at them without remembering the things I had witnessed, things that defied all logic and reason. It wasn't just the memories that haunted me. It was the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting for me to return. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent. They followed me in the quiet moments, when I was alone, when the world around me fell silent. I would hear them in the rustling of leaves, in the creaking of trees, in the sound of wind brushing through branches. Sometimes I could almost hear them calling my name, beckoning me back to the forest. I tried to convince myself that I had made it out, that I had escaped. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe. There was no comfort in the daylight, no peace in the quiet of my own home. Every time the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows grew longer, stretching into the corners of my mind. I would lie in bed at night, eyes wide open, listening to the sounds of the world around me. Every creak of the house, every groan of the floorboards, felt like it could be something else, something sinister creeping closer. And then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, when I heard it. The whisper. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. Come back. My heart stopped. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same as the one I had heard in the forest, the one that had called to me in those final moments before I fled. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The creature was still out there. I sprang out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the shadows long and heavy, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. I couldn't let myself believe that the forest had followed me here, that it had found me again. But deep down, I knew it had. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me after everything I had been through. But the fear that gripped me was undeniable. I could feel it in the air, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with its presence. For weeks after that, the whispers continued. At first, they were faint, like distant echoes carried on the wind. But over time, they grew louder. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to be getting closer. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest was reaching out to me, pulling me back into its grasp. I started researching, trying to make sense of everything I had experienced. I combed through books, articles, and old legends, searching for any mention of the forest or the creature I had encountered. What I found disturbed me more than I could have imagined. There were stories, old stories, about a cursed forest, one that had been feared for centuries. It was said to be alive, a place where time and reality bent and twisted. It was a place where things didn't belong, where ancient forces roamed free, waiting for the right moment to claim those who dared to enter. The stories matched my experience too closely to be a coincidence. It was as if the forest had been waiting for me, drawing me in, making me part of its dark history. I had unwittingly stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. something that I should have never disturbed. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending that it was all in my head. The forest had marked me, and I couldn't escape it. I knew that now. I had no choice but to face whatever it was that haunted me. I had to return to the woods. I'm not sure why I decided to go back. Maybe it was out of a need for closure, a need to understand what had happened to me. Or maybe it was just the realization that I couldn't outrun it any longer. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest once again, staring into the darkness. The air felt colder now, heavier, as if the forest had been waiting for me to return. The trees loomed before me like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching into the sky. The whispers were louder now, closer. I could hear them clearly, soft, insistent voices that seemed to be calling my name, urging me to come closer. I stood there for a long time, my feet frozen to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to step forward. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. The forest had a pull on me, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the very earth beneath my feet was calling to me, pulling me into its depths. I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember, I was back in town, standing in front of my house. It was daylight, the sun shining brightly overhead, but everything felt wrong. The whispers were gone, but the silence was deafening. The forest was behind me, but I could still feel its presence, a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I never spoke about what happened that day or the days that followed. No one would have believed me, even if I tried to explain. But I can't shake the feeling that the forest is still out there, waiting, watching. Maybe one day it will call to me again. And maybe, just maybe, I'll answer.